Escort her out. Now!
Rose was being thrown out.
Do not let her speak to the bride.
Grant wanted her silenced. Maya saw everything.
Aunt Rose! What is happening?
Give me the box, and this ends quietly.
The box terrified him.
Let her go.
Do not sign anything. You need to hear the truth. That man is lying to you, Maya. Your grandmother knew exactly who you would become.
Security will handle her.
His mother helped hide it.
Tell me the truth.
His grandmother left this for you. The twin sharks.
16 months earlier, it all seemed impossible. At 31, Maya had built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and meaningful to anyone who knew her. She taught at a public school on the east side of Briarwood, where she worked with children whose families had learned to measure time in appointments, bus schedules, and insurance denials. Her classroom was full of picture cards, weighted blankets, chipped tables, and little victories that never made the news. Maya knew the names of every child who hated loud rooms, every parent who had learned to apologize for arriving late, and every student who had been told, directly or indirectly, that their needs were too expensive. She had not grown up with much. Her mother, Lila, had been a reading specialist who believed that every child deserved at least one adult who saw potential before behavior. When Lila died suddenly after a brief illness, Maya was 14. Rose, Lila's older sister, had taken her in without speeches or conditions. Rose had worked night shifts as a home care nurse then, and money was always tight. But Maya never remembered feeling unwanted. She remembered packed lunches, secondhand books, birthday cakes that leaned to one side, and a woman who would stay awake until dawn after a double shift just to make sure Maya had finished her homework. Rose never pretended their life was glamorous. She taught Maya how to repair a hem, how to stretch soup across 3 dinners, how to recognize when someone was treating kindness as weakness. There was one lesson, however, that Maya had never fully understood. Rose believed that the people most eager to be admired were often the people least willing to be known. Maya used to think it was simply the wisdom of someone who had spent decades in strangers' homes, watching families perform love for visitors and abandon it when the doors closed. Then Grant Holloway arrived at her school with a camera crew, a group of foundation staff, and a donation large enough to replace the classroom equipment Maya had spent years begging the district to approve. The Holloway Foundation had been a familiar name in Briarwood for as long as Maya could remember. It funded scholarships, literacy centers, hospital wings, and polished advertisements about lifting communities through opportunity. Its founder, Eleanor Holloway, had been remembered as a stern but generous woman who turned a small family business into a philanthropic empire. After Eleanor's death, the foundation passed into the hands of her daughter, Catherine, and her grandson, Grant. They appeared in magazines, stood beside oversized checks, and spoke often about legacy. Grant entered Maya's classroom in a tailored suit that did not quite belong among finger paint and sensory toys. Yet he seemed to know exactly how to make himself fit. He knelt beside a student who had trouble making eye contact. He listened while Maya explained why a new communications device could change a child's day. He asked questions that made her believe he had actually read the proposal rather than simply approved it. By the end of the visit, he had promised not only the devices, but a small grant for teacher training across the district. Maya was careful at first. She had seen wealthy people arrive with announcements and leave before the real work began. But Grant kept returning. He attended school board meetings. He remembered the names of students. He sent handwritten notes after difficult weeks. And when he asked Maya to dinner, he did it without making her feel like a charitable project he had decided to rescue. Their relationship moved quickly, though not carelessly. Grant took Maya to quiet restaurants rather than the places reporters followed him. He listened when she talked about her students, even when the stories had no easy ending. He seemed to admire that she did not chase his money or his family name. In fact, he often said that being with her felt like stepping outside the world that expected something from him every minute of the day. Rose did not share Maya's confidence. She was polite to Grant, never openly hostile, but she watched him in a way that made him uncomfortable. She noticed how his generosity increased when a camera was nearby. She noticed that he asked Maya to send photographs whenever a new device arrived at school, then later claimed those photographs had inspired the Foundation's latest campaign. She noticed the small pauses in his expression when Maya disagreed with him, the faint tightening around his mouth when anyone failed to admire him quickly enough. Still, Rose said little. Maya had spent most of her life being underestimated because of where she came from. Rose did not want to become another person, telling her that happiness was too fragile for someone like them to trust. So she kept her concerns to herself, hoping she was wrong. For a while, it seemed she might be. Grant proposed on a winter evening beneath the lights of a small botanical garden that had been closed to the public for the night. There were no journalists, no celebrity friends, no branded banners. Maya believed that was proof the moment belonged only to them. When she said yes, Grant held her as though he had been waiting his whole life for someone who did not care about the Holloway name. The engagement changed the temperature around them almost immediately. Catherine Holloway began appearing more often, always elegant, always measured, always able to make a criticism sound like concern. She offered to manage the wedding because, as she gently suggested, a marriage into the Holloway family attracted attention, and attention required care. She selected the chapel, the guest list, the flowers, the menus, and eventually most of the people allowed to have an opinion. At first, Maya accepted this as generosity. She had never planned a wedding and did not want to be ungrateful. But Catherine's help came with a quiet process of removal. Maya's co-workers were shifted to a distant table because the room was limited. Rose was advised that a smaller family dinner before the ceremony might be more comfortable than the main reception. A photo of Maya's mother, which Maya wanted near the ceremony flowers, was described as too personal for the visual plan. Each decision seemed minor by itself. Together, they made Maya feel less like a bride and more like a detail being arranged. Grant always found a way to smooth it over. He told Maya his mother had spent her life managing public attention and did not know how to stop. He promised that once the wedding was over, they would build a life with fewer expectations and more space. Maya wanted to believe him. Every time doubt appeared, she reminded herself of the man who had sat on the floor of her classroom and listened to a child struggle to form one sentence. Rose, however, recognized something Maya did not. She had seen Catherine Holloway before, though Maya had never known it. Nearly 20 years earlier, Rose had worked as a private nurse for Eleanor Holloway during the final season of Eleanor's life. By then, Eleanor was no longer the towering public figure people admired from newspaper photographs. She was ill, exhausted, and increasingly troubled by things happening inside the Foundation that carried her name. Rose had been hired because Eleanor wanted someone outside the family. She had told the agency that she needed a nurse who could be trusted not to confuse employment with loyalty to Catherine or Grant. Rose had not understood the significance of that request until the nights when Eleanor could not sleep. On those nights, the old woman spoke less about death than betrayal. She had built the Holloway Foundation to keep children from being discarded by systems that found them inconvenient. Yet she had begun to suspect that her own family was using the foundation as a stage set, moving money through polished programs while the people in greatest need were removed from the picture. Eleanor never gave Rose every detail. She was too careful for that. But she did ask Rose to keep a cedar box hidden where Catherine would never think to look. She told her that the box contained what mattered if the family ever tried to turn compassion into a costume. Rose had promised without understanding how expensive that promise would become. After Eleanor died, Catherine claimed that the final estate documents had been settled. The foundation continued, and Grant grew into its public face. Rose received no invitation to the funeral reception. She kept the box in the back of a linen cabinet for years, telling herself that perhaps the danger Eleanor feared had passed. Then Grant began dating Maya. The first warning came 6 weeks before the wedding, when Rose visited Maya's apartment and found a stack of documents waiting to be signed. Maya had been told they were standard papers connected to her future role at the foundation. Grant wanted her to become the public education ambassador after the honeymoon. He said her work with children made her the perfect person to lead a new initiative. Rose read only a few pages before her hands began to shake. Buried beneath language about reputation, privacy, and coordinated communication was a clause preventing Maya from making public statements about foundation activities without written approval. There were financial penalties, confidentiality rules, and restrictions that would follow her even if she stepped away from the role. It was not a partnership agreement, it was a leash. That night, Rose went home, opened the linen cabinet, and took out the cedar box for the first time in almost 2 decades. Inside, beneath a yellowing knit scarf Eleanor had once used to wrap the documents, were pages bearing the old woman's signature, a sealed letter addressed to Rose, and a thin ledger written in a disciplined hand. The first page of the letter made one thing painfully clear. Eleanor had not asked Rose to protect a fortune. She had asked her to protect people. And if the day came when a Holloway tried to use marriage, charity, or public admiration to silence someone vulnerable, Rose was to make sure the truth reached the light. Rose had no idea how close that day was until the morning of Maya's wedding. The morning of the wedding arrived under a hard, bright sky that made every window of the Holloway estate shine. By 7 o'clock, the chapel garden was already filled with florists, caterers, stylists, photographers, and assistants carrying clipboards. The place looked less like a home than a machine built to manufacture a perfect memory. Every rose had been inspected. Every candle had been placed at the correct height. Every place card had been checked twice. And in the center of it all, Maya was being prepared to marry the man everyone insisted had given her a life beyond anything she could have imagined. Rose arrived alone just after 9. She wore the blue dress Maya had helped her choose, a simple coat against the morning chill, and the old cedar box tucked inside a canvas bag. She had spent the night reading Eleanor's letter until the words blurred. There was no instruction telling her to interrupt a wedding, no sentence ordering her to humiliate Grant or expose the family in front of strangers. Eleanor had only asked her to act before another innocent person became part of a lie. That difference mattered to Rose. She did not want revenge. She did not even want to ruin Grant. What frightened her was the thought of Maya spending years trying to understand why the man she loved had slowly taken control of her voice, her work, and her memories of what was right. Rose had watched that happen to women before. It rarely began with cruelty that anyone else could see. It began with decisions made on their behalf, concerns dismissed as stress, and gratitude demanded in exchange for a comfortable cage. Catherine saw Rose before Maya did. Her eyes moved to the canvas bag, then to Rose's shoes, then to the anxious way Rose searched the corridor for someone who could take her to the bridal room. Catherine greeted her with polished restraint, but the message beneath her manners was immediate. Rose had not been expected to arrive so early, and the family could not allow distractions on a day meant to be photographed from every angle. Rose asked to speak with Maya privately. Catherine explained that the bride was overwhelmed and could not be disturbed. Rose said the matter could not wait. Catherine's expression barely changed, but she sent an assistant to find Grant. Grant appeared several minutes later in his formal suit, surrounded by the calm authority of someone accustomed to people making space for him. At first, he treated Rose like an inconvenience that could be managed. He suggested she give Maya the box after the ceremony. He reminded her that the bride had enough emotions to handle. He implied that an old family matter could surely wait until the guests had gone home. Then Rose told him that the box had belonged to Eleanor. The change in Grant was small, but Rose had spent enough years at bedsides to recognize the body's betrayal of the mind. His shoulders tightened, his gaze dropped toward the bag, and returned too quickly. For a moment, the careful warmth in his face disappeared. He asked Rose what exactly Eleanor had given her. Rose did not answer. She only said that Maya needed to see it before signing anything connected to the Holloway Foundation. That was when Grant stopped pretending this was a misunderstanding. He spoke to Rose in the low, controlled manner of a man who knew anger would look bad if anyone overheard. He suggested that grief could distort old memories. He implied that she might be confused by documents she did not understand. He warned her that upsetting Maya on her wedding day would be unforgivable. Rose had heard sharper words in hospital rooms, usually from families who had mistaken fear for authority. She told him that a person who feared the truth before a marriage had no right to ask for trust after it. Grant's face hardened. He did not order the guards to remove her immediately. Not then. He knew that would draw attention. Instead, he asked one of Catherine's assistants to escort Rose to a side lounge and promised that Maya would join her when she was ready. It was a softer form of exile, designed to look considerate. For 20 minutes, Rose sat alone in a room decorated with cream-colored furniture she was afraid to touch. Outside the door, footsteps passed without stopping. The wedding moved forward as though she had already been erased from it. She could hear distant music being tested in the chapel and the low murmur of guests arriving. With every minute, she felt the old weight of hesitation return. Perhaps Maya deserved a quiet day. Perhaps Rose was about to damage the one thing her niece had allowed herself to want. Then she remembered Lila. She remembered Maya at 14, trying to be brave at a funeral because she thought crying would make Rose's burden heavier. She remembered every time Maya had stood up for a child who had been treated as difficult rather than deserving. and she realized that protecting Maya's peace by hiding the truth was not protection at all. It was surrender. Rose left the lounge and headed toward the bridal corridor. The assistant tried to stop her. Rose apologized and kept walking. Catherine saw her approaching and immediately understood what was happening. Grant had just taken his place near the chapel entrance, where the first guests could see him. To anyone watching, he looked composed and proud. But when Rose reached the corridor, his composure cracked. Maya was only a few doors away, surrounded by bridesmaids and makeup artists. She heard raised voices, then stepped into the hall before someone could close the door. Her wedding dress caught the morning light, and for a second, Rose saw the little girl she had raised, dressed for a future Rose had once believed would be safe. Grant moved between them. He told Maya that Rose was tired and upset, that she had become confused about an old matter related to his grandmother. He made it sound merciful, as though he were protecting both women from embarrassment. Maya looked at Rose, waiting for her aunt to deny it or explain. Rose tried to reach into the bag. Grant caught her wrist. It was not a violent movement. That was what made it worse. It was quick, controlled, almost invisible. But Maya saw it. She saw the way Rose flinched. She saw the anger in Grant's eyes before he replaced it with concern. And something inside her shifted. Grant released Rose immediately and tried to draw Maya away from the moment. He reminded her that hundreds of guests were arriving. He spoke about timing, pressure, and how much stress Rose must be under. He made the entire situation sound like a fragile inconvenience that Maya had the duty to manage. Maya asked Rose whether she needed help. Rose looked at her, then at Grant, and made a decision that broke her own heart. She told Maya that she did, but that the truth could not be spoken in a hallway full of people who wanted it hidden. Catherine called security. What happened next was the moment that would later be described in different ways by every person who had witnessed it. Some guests would say Rose refused to cooperate. Others would insist the guards were only guiding her outside. Catherine would claim the family had been concerned for Rose's well-being. Grant would tell anyone who listened that he had tried to protect Maya from a painful misunderstanding. But Maya remembered the facts. She remembered Rose clutching the cedar box. She remembered the guards treating a 68-year-old woman as though dignity were something that could be removed by force. She remembered Grant watching instead of stopping them. And she remembered the hollow feeling that came when a person she loved showed her, without realizing it, who they were. Rose was taken through the side doors and into the driveway. The music inside the chapel swelled. The wedding coordinator hurried Maya toward the room where she was supposed to wait until the processional. Everyone spoke at once, telling her there was no need to worry, no need to ruin the day, no need to let Rose's confusion become a disaster. Maya let them lead her for several steps. Then she stopped. The word disaster lingered in her mind. It was the same word Grant had used 3 weeks earlier when one of his Foundation employees had tried to meet with him after being dismissed. Maya had asked what happened, and Grant had said the employee was creating a disaster because she had misunderstood how professional organizations worked. At the time, Maya had accepted the explanation. Now she remembered the coldness behind it. She looked down at her hands and noticed something folded beneath the white ribbon of her bouquet. Rose must have slipped it there when Grant had grabbed her wrist. It was a single page torn from Eleanor's letter. Maya read it in the quiet of the preparation room while her bridesmaids watched her face change. The handwriting was weak but clear. Eleanor had written that there were people who called themselves guardians of a legacy, while feeding on the very trust they were supposed to protect. She had written that the family's greatest danger was not scandal, but the habit of teaching others to confuse wealth with virtue. And near the bottom of the page, she had left a warning addressed not to Maya by name, but to whoever might one day be asked to marry into the Holloway world. Never sign away your voice in exchange for a place at their table. Maya read the sentence twice. Then she asked her bridesmaids to leave. For the first time all morning, no one told her what the next step should be. Outside, Grant was taking his place near the altar. He believed Rose had been removed. He believed the box was still in her hands, but far enough away to handle after the ceremony. He believed Maya had been surrounded by enough pressure, beauty, and expectation to keep her moving forward. He did not understand that the best thing Rose had ever given Maya was not shelter, food, or even love. It was the ability to recognize the moment when silence became a betrayal. Maya removed her veil, not because she had decided anything yet, but because she needed to see clearly. Then she left the room through the service hallway, past the floral displays and polished mirrors, and walked toward the driveway where Rose was waiting beside the car that had brought her there. The ceremony had not begun, but the marriage was already over. Rose was sitting on the low stone wall near the estate driveway when Maya found her. The security men had stepped back once they realized the bride was walking toward them, but they remained close enough to remind Rose that even outside the chapel, the Holloway family believed they could decide where she belonged. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. Maya stood in her wedding dress without a veil, carrying a bouquet she no longer knew what to do with. Rose looked smaller than she had that morning, not because she was weak, but because the years of keeping Eleanor's secret had suddenly become visible in the curve of her shoulders. Maya sat beside her and reached for the cedar box. Rose did not hand it over immediately. She asked Maya to understand that whatever happened next had to be Maya's choice. Rose had not come to command her, to punish Grant, or to turn one terrible morning into the only definition of Maya's life. She had come because a marriage could survive disappointment, fear, even ordinary mistakes. It could not survive a foundation built on contempt. Then she opened the box. Inside was the original third codicil to Eleanor Holloway's will, signed before 2 independent witnesses and sealed by a small legal practice outside Briarwood. It had never appeared in the estate papers Catherine presented after Eleanor died. The document did not take every dollar from the Holloway family or hand Rose some secret fortune. Its purpose was more precise. Eleanor had placed the voting control of the foundation into a protective trust, to be activated if a member of her family used the organization to conceal fraud, retaliate against employees, or coerce another person into surrendering their voice for the sake of the Holloway name. Rose had also kept a ledger Eleanor compiled during the last months of her life. It tracked grants that were publicly announced but never fully delivered, contracts redirected through companies controlled by Catherine's friends, and scholarships that disappeared from internal lists after the cameras had gone. The final pages contained names. They were not the names of powerful people. They belonged to teachers, community coordinators, social workers, and former foundation employees who had tried to raise concerns and had been quietly pushed out. There was one name Maya recognized at once. It belonged to a woman named Helena Ward, a former director of the Holloway Education Initiative. 3 weeks earlier, Grant had called Helena a disgruntled employee who had tried to create problems after losing her position. Maya had believed him because she wanted to believe him. But the ledger showed that Helena had objected to funds being moved out of school programs and into a marketing campaign designed around Grant's public image. Her dismissal had not been a misunderstanding. It had been retaliation. At the bottom of the box lay the agreement Grant wanted Maya to sign after the wedding. Rose had found a copy among documents left at Maya's apartment. Eleanor's letter explained why it mattered. Grant was not simply inviting Maya to become an ambassador for the foundation. He wanted her to become the moral face of a new campaign while binding her to confidentiality terms that would make it difficult for her to speak if she discovered what the family had done. Maya held the papers in her lap. The chapel bells began to ring behind them, a signal that the ceremony should be starting. For years, she had thought love meant believing in the best version of someone until they proved otherwise. But looking at the documents, she understood that Grant had already proved otherwise. She had simply been given reasons to look away. Rose told her there was one more thing Maya needed to know. Before coming to the wedding, Rose had sent copies of every document to the legal practice named in Eleanor's codicil and to the 3 independent trustees Eleanor had selected long ago. Rose had delayed for years because the evidence alone had not been enough to show the full pattern. But Grant's attempt to bind Maya to silence, combined with his treatment of Rose that morning, had made the pattern impossible to deny. Maya could not undo what Grant had done. She could not bring back the employees who had lost their jobs, or the children whose programs had been cut while the Holloways posed for photographs. But she could refuse to become the next polished layer over the truth. She stood and took Rose's hand. When they walked back into the chapel, the guests turned toward them with the curiosity of people who had waited too long without an explanation. Grant was at the altar beneath an arch of white flowers, looking composed, but increasingly irritated. Catherine sat in the front row, her face fixed in the expression of someone prepared to call anything inconvenient a misunderstanding. Maya did not rush. She did not let the wedding coordinator guide her into position. She walked down the aisle beside Rose, not because Rose needed to be rescued, but because neither of them would be separated again to make someone else comfortable. Grant tried to meet Maya with concern. He made the expression of a man ready to forgive a bride for panicking under pressure. He moved toward her, as though the only obstacle between them was a private emotional moment that could be smoothed over with the right words. Maya stopped several feet away. She told him, before their families and the people who had come to admire them, that there would be no wedding. She said she could not marry a man who treated her aunt's dignity as an inconvenience. She could not marry someone who used charity to build his image while hiding the harm done to the people who trusted him. And she would not sign away her voice so that the Holloway family could keep calling itself generous. The room did not explode into chaos. Real shock rarely does. It arrived as stillness. Grant's first instinct was to deny everything. He insisted that Rose had misunderstood old documents and that Maya had been manipulated on an emotional day. He suggested that the papers belonged in the hands of lawyers, not guests. In a narrow sense, he was right. The documents did belong with lawyers. That was exactly where Rose had already sent them. But Grant made one mistake. In trying to diminish Rose, he revealed the same contempt that had brought them all to that moment. He described her as a former employee who had spent too long attached to the family's past. He spoke as though years of service made her less credible, not more. Several people in the room looked at one another. Some had worked with the foundation. Some had seen the polished version of Grant for years. And suddenly, they remembered the staff members who had vanished The programs announced with fanfare and then quietly abandoned. The questions that had never received answers. Catherine rose from her seat and tried to take control. She suggested postponing the ceremony, moving the discussion somewhere private, protecting Maya from further embarrassment. But Maya understood the language now. Private had always meant hidden. Protected had always meant silenced. She placed the cedar box on the front pew and walked out of the chapel with Rose. The photographs later showed the moment in a way no one could have planned. The bride was still wearing white, but she was not crying. Rose was still carrying her worn canvas bag. Behind them, the flowers, musicians, and imported decorations remained exactly where they had been placed. Expensive proof that beauty could not save a lie once the truth had entered the room. The fallout did not happen in one dramatic afternoon. It happened through letters, audits, meetings, frozen accounts, and people finally realizing they were no longer alone. Within 48 hours, the independent trustees filed for an emergency review of the Holloway Foundation. The legal practice confirmed the authenticity of Eleanor's codicil. Grant's public role was suspended, while outside auditors examined the records, and Catherine resigned from the board before the trustees could vote to remove her. The family's public relations team called it a dispute over estate documents, but that explanation collapsed when former employees began sharing their own records. Helena Ward came forward first, with years of emails showing that Grant's office had delayed grants until media campaigns could be arranged. A regional coordinator described programs cut because the children they served did not fit the right image. A finance manager produced instructions to classify image-building expenses as community outreach. The Holloways had protected themselves by making each person believe their experience was isolated. Once those people compared their records, the pattern was impossible to deny. The investigation found that Grant had inherited a culture of manipulation from Catherine and had learned to make it look modern, polished, and strategic. But he had intensified it. He planned to make Maya the face of an education campaign because her sincerity gave him what money could not buy: credibility. Grant had spent years deciding which children were visible enough to deserve help. In the end, his future depended on the testimony of people he had tried to make invisible. The Protective Trust took control of the foundation's voting rights. It rebuilt the board with teachers, community representatives, former program staff, and independent financial oversight. Grants were reviewed, neglected programs were restored where possible, and the people who had been ignored were finally given a chance to speak before decisions were made again. Grant faced civil cases, financial inquiries, lost partnerships, and the collapse of the public platform he had treated as proof of his worth. More painful to him than the money was the loss of control. For the first time, he could not shape the narrative with a smile, a speech, or a carefully placed photograph. Catherine watched the family name become a symbol of everything Eleanor had tried to prevent. She was undone, not by a stranger, but by the records of the woman she had dismissed as powerless. Rose did not become rich or accept a seat at the head of the foundation. She returned to her small apartment and neighborhood clinic, but the trustees asked her to serve as a community advisor. She agreed only if teachers and families had more influence than donors. Maya took time away from work after the wedding that never happened. She grieved the man she thought Grant was, the future she had imagined, and the embarrassment of having nearly walked into a life designed to shrink her. But she did not regret leaving. She learned that heartbreak was not proof of weakness. Sometimes it was proof that a person had chosen truth before comfort. Months later, Maya returned to her classroom. The room still had chipped tables, picture cards, and students who needed more help than the system could easily provide. But the Holloway Foundation, now under new oversight, funded the program without camera crews or branding requirements. Maya refused the title of ambassador when the trustees offered it. She chose instead to help create a teacher-led advisory group that no single wealthy family could control. On the first day the new devices arrived, Maya watched one of her students use a communication screen to tell his mother that he was happy. It was a small sentence. No newspaper printed it. No donor stood nearby to claim credit. Yet Maya thought of Eleanor, of Rose, and of all the people whose names had been hidden in a ledger because someone believed their lives were not impressive enough to matter. That was the lesson Grant Holloway never understood. A person's value is not measured by the room they are allowed to enter, the clothes they can afford, or the power they seem to hold. It is measured by what they do when someone else's dignity is placed in their hands. And sometimes, the person everyone tries to remove from the room is the only one carrying the truth that can save it. If this story moved you, remember this. Never confuse polished appearances with good character. The way someone treats those they believe cannot help them will always reveal more than the words they use in public. By the time Eleanor May Carter entered the school gymnasium, the parents had already decided she was guilty.
Everyone here deserves to see who was responsible.
Some of them had spent the night beside hospital beds, terrified after their children became sick from lunch at Willowbrook Academy. They wanted someone to blame, and the school had given them the easiest person in the building to hate.
Willowbrook will not tolerate negligence where children's lives are concerned.
Not the principal who had ignored the warning before anything happened.
The children need the truth more than they need someone to blame.
Not the operations director who had approved the cheaper food supplier behind the scenes.
Do not make this worse for yourself.
Not the board members who cared more about reputation than the safety of the children. They gave them Eleanor, the old lunch lady in the faded cafeteria uniform. She stood beneath the bright gym lights with her hands folded, while sealed lunch trays waited like evidence. Wealthy parents whispered, cried, and stared as if 12 years of kindness had suddenly become a crime.
We are reviewing the actions of the employee closest to the food service.
But earlier that day, Eleanor had seen something wrong in the cafeteria before anyone else understood the danger.
Please bring the school nurse here now.
In her pocket was a small notebook filled with names, allergies, symptoms, and the exact times everything began. It was not the notebook of a careless cafeteria worker. It was the notebook of a nurse, and she had saved them.
Before this ends, you will know who really protected them.
Long before the parents of Willowbrook Academy filled the gymnasium with anger, long before sealed lunch trays were placed on a table, like criminal evidence, long before Eleanor May Carter stood under those bright lights, with the whole school looking at her as if she had tried to hurt the children she loved, she had been known for one simple thing. She remembered every child. Not in the way teachers remembered grades, or administrators remembered tuition records, or board members remembered last names attached to donations. Eleanor remembered the details that did not appear in glossy school brochures. She remembered which first grader needed his sandwich cut smaller, because he still panicked when food felt too large in his mouth. She remembered which little girl pretended not to like apples because her loose tooth made them hurt. She remembered which boy from the scholarship program came through the lunch line smiling too brightly on Mondays because weekends in his house did not always include enough food. She remembered allergies, fears, quiet embarrassments, missing lunch cards, and the children who stood at the back of the line pretending they were not hungry because pride was sometimes the only thing a child owned. To most people at Willowbrook, she was just the lunch lady. That was what they called her when they were being polite. When they were not being polite, they called her the old woman in the cafeteria, the one with the faded apron, the cheap shoes, and the hands that moved too slowly during rush hour. Some parents did not know her name at all. They only knew that she stood behind the serving counter with a hairnet, a ladle, and a face that seemed to belong to a different world than the one Willowbrook sold to the public. Willowbrook Academy was the kind of school that never described itself as rich, because rich schools preferred words like distinguished, selective, historic, and exceptional. Its main building had tall windows, polished floors, and a stone entrance where prospective families paused for photographs. The admissions office smelled like fresh flowers and expensive coffee. The walls were covered with framed college acceptance letters, championship banners, and carefully staged pictures of smiling children in clean uniforms. Every year, the school printed a brochure promising that Willowbrook did not simply educate students, it formed future leaders. But Eleanor knew what every old building knew. A place could shine in the front and rot quietly in the back. The cafeteria was not in the brochure. It sat behind the arts wing, past a hallway where the paint had begun to peel near the baseboards and the heating vents rattled every winter. The kitchen had old ovens, chipped tiles, a walk-in refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and a loading door where suppliers dropped off crates before sunrise. It was not beautiful, but Eleanor treated it like a place that mattered. She wiped the counters twice when once would have been enough. She checked expiration dates, even when the delivery men rolled their eyes. She kept a small notebook in the pocket of her apron and wrote down things no one had asked her to track. To the school, that notebook looked like a habit. To Eleanor, it was protection. There were names inside it, dozens of them, written in careful blue ink. Children with peanut allergies. Children who could not have dairy. Children who had asthma. Children whose parents forgot to update medical forms. Children who became dizzy if they skipped breakfast. Children who needed to sit after running. Children who hid medication in backpacks because they were embarrassed to go to the nurse's office. Eleanor kept the notebook because she knew paperwork could be late, systems could fail, and adults could be careless when no one forced them to look closely. She had learned that lesson in another life. Before Willowbrook, before the cafeteria uniform, before parents looked past her as if she were part of the furniture, Eleanor had worn scrubs under brighter lights than any school gymnasium. She had spent 27 years as an emergency nurse at St. Agnes Medical Center, where time was measured in heartbeats and mistakes did not wait for committee meetings. She had known the sound of a child struggling to breathe before a monitor confirmed it. She had known when a mother's calm voice was hiding terror. She had known how quickly a normal afternoon could become the worst day of a family's life. She had been good at it. Not famous. Nurses rarely were. But the doctors trusted her eyes, and younger nurses learned to watch her hands. Eleanor could enter a room and sense what was wrong before the chart had fully loaded. She noticed color, breath, sweat, posture, pupils, panic. She knew when someone was pretending to be fine, and when someone did not have the strength to pretend anymore. For years, she saved lives without speeches, without applause, and without anyone outside the hospital knowing her name. Then one winter night changed the shape of her forever. A little boy had come into the emergency room too late. He had been quiet, too quiet, the way very sick children sometimes were. His mother kept apologizing for not bringing him sooner, as if poverty, fear, and bad transportation were personal failures instead of the traps they often became. Eleanor did everything right. The team did everything right. But sometimes doing everything right still leaves you standing beside a bed after the machines stop, holding the silence like broken glass. People told Eleanor it was not her fault. They told her she could not save everyone. They told her experience would help her survive grief. They were wrong about that last part. Experience did not make grief smaller. It only made it more precise. After that night, Eleanor found that she could still do the work, but she could no longer leave the hospital without hearing the mother's apology in her head. She could no longer pass a child in the grocery store without checking the color of his lips. She could no longer sleep through a siren. Eventually, she retired earlier than anyone expected, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had cared so deeply for so long that something inside her had worn thin. Willowbrook was supposed to be quieter. That was what she told herself when she took the cafeteria job. Children eating lunch, trays sliding across counters, fruit cups, soup, pasta, warm rolls, milk cartons. No trauma bay, no alarms, no doctors calling for equipment, no mothers praying in hallways, Just ordinary care, the kind no one noticed unless it disappeared. And for a while, that was enough. The children noticed her before the adults did. Children often have a sharper eye for kindness than grown people. They noticed that Eleanor never made them feel ashamed if their lunch account was low. They noticed she placed extra crackers on the trays of children who looked tired. They noticed that if someone dropped food and looked ready to cry, Eleanor would quietly replace it before anyone could laugh. They noticed that she never called attention to the students who needed free meals. At Willowbrook, where some children arrived in cars that cost more than Eleanor's house, dignity was not a small gift. It was survival. But the adults saw something else. They saw an older woman with no degree hanging on the cafeteria wall. They saw a uniform instead of a history. They saw someone useful, replaceable, and safely beneath them. Principal Preston Vale, especially, saw her that way. Dr. Preston Vale had built his career on sounding compassionate in rooms where compassion was useful. He had a polished voice, silver hair, and the kind of smile that made donors feel their money was becoming virtue. He spoke often about safety, excellence, and the sacred trust of educating children. He knew how to pause before important words. He knew how to place one hand over his heart at assemblies. He knew how to make parents believe Willowbrook was not just a school, but a shield. Eleanor had worked around emergencies too long to be fooled by calm voices. She had seen men like Preston Vale in hospitals, not the cruel kind who shouted, the worst kind, the kind who spoke softly while moving blame away from themselves, the kind who never dirtied their hands, yet somehow always stood far from the consequences. Still, Eleanor kept her distance. She was not there to challenge him. She was there to feed children. The real trouble began when Willowbrook changed food suppliers. For years, the cafeteria had used a local family company. The produce was not perfect, but it was clean, familiar, and delivered by people who answered questions directly. Eleanor knew the delivery drivers. She knew which crates came from which farms. She knew what the lettuce should smell like when it was fresh, and what chicken looked like when it had been rushed through a bad cooler. It was not a glamorous system, but it worked because the people inside it cared enough to be embarrassed when something went wrong. Then Marissa Lang arrived. Marissa was Willowbrook's new director of operations, hired to modernize the school's internal systems, which was the kind of phrase that often meant cutting costs without saying cutting costs. She was young, sharp, and always dressed as if she expected to be photographed near a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She carried a tablet everywhere and spoke about efficiency as if it were a moral virtue. Within 3 months, she had replaced the old supplier with a regional food distributor that offered lower prices, cleaner invoices, and brochures full of smiling farms that Eleanor had never heard of. Eleanor asked questions the first morning the new delivery arrived. No one thanked her for it. The crates looked right at a glance. The labels were neat. The boxes were stacked properly. The delivery sheet was clean. But Eleanor had learned long ago that danger often entered a room looking organized. She noticed condensation where it should not have been. She noticed one container of pre-cut fruit smelled faintly sour beneath the sweetness. She noticed sealed bags of greens that looked too wet inside, as if they had been washed, sealed, warmed, and chilled again. Most people would have missed it. Most people were allowed to miss it. Eleanor was not. She told Marissa the produce needed to be inspected before serving. Marissa did not listen with her ears. She listened with her title. She reminded Eleanor, in that smooth administrative way, that the supplier had already passed the required checks. She explained that the school could not delay lunch service because an employee had an uncomfortable feeling about sealed food. She suggested that perhaps Eleanor was struggling with new procedures and should allow trained operations staff to handle vendor compliance. It was a polite way of telling her to stay behind the counter. Eleanor did not argue loudly. Loudness had never been her way. But from that day forward, she wrote more in her notebook. Delivery times, lot numbers when she could see them, temperature readings from the cafeteria thermometer, children who complained about stomach aches after certain meals, food that arrived too close to expiration, containers that looked wrong, patterns too small for administrators to care about, and too large for Eleanor to ignore. She brought the concerns to the school nurse first. The nurse was kind, but overwhelmed, responsible for hundreds of students, medication forms, scraped knees, headaches, panic attacks, and parents who believed every sneeze deserved an immediate phone call. She promised to mention it to administration. Eleanor knew from the way she lowered her voice that the promise was sincere and probably useless. Then Eleanor wrote a memo. She did not use dramatic language. She knew better. Dramatic language made people defensive. She listed dates, symptoms, delivery concerns, and her recommendation that Willowbrook pause service from the new supplier until an independent inspection could be completed. She placed one copy in Marissa's inbox and another in the principal's office. Days passed. Nothing changed. The new supplier kept coming. The invoices kept shrinking. Marissa's confidence grew. Preston Vale praised her at a staff meeting for responsible stewardship of school resources. Board members liked numbers that moved in the right direction. Parents liked tuition increases that could be delayed another year. No one wanted to know why savings had appeared so quickly, because quick savings feel like intelligence until someone gets hurt. Eleanor kept feeding children, and every day, the cafeteria became a little harder for her to trust. There was one child she watched more closely than the others. His name was Caleb Morrison, a 7-year-old with round glasses, restless hands, and a peanut allergy severe enough that Eleanor had written his name on the first page of her notebook and underlined it twice. Caleb was the kind of child who apologized when other people bumped into him. He came through the lunch line with careful politeness, always thanking Eleanor, as if she had prepared the food just for him. His mother, Hannah Morrison, was a nurse's aide at a senior home and one of the few parents who knew Eleanor's name. She worked long shifts and arrived at school events in shoes that looked too tired for the polished hallways. Willowbrook liked scholarship families and photographs, but in real life, people like Hannah were often made to feel grateful for standing in spaces their children had earned. Eleanor understood that feeling. So she watched Caleb. She checked labels twice when he came through the line. She kept safe snacks in a separate container. She made sure no one mocked him when he asked what was in a sauce. Caleb trusted her, and that trust frightened her more than disrespect ever had. Disrespect could be endured. Trust had to be protected. The day of the poisoning began beautifully. That was the detail Eleanor would remember later with a bitterness that tasted almost like metal. The sky was bright. The school lawn had been trimmed. A group of wealthy prospective parents were touring campus, guided by Preston Vale himself. The children were excited because lunch included roasted chicken, fruit cups, and a bright green salad the school planned to feature in promotional photographs about healthy meals. Marissa moved through the cafeteria before service with unusual energy, adjusting table displays and reminding staff that presentation mattered. Eleanor was at the loading door when the produce arrived. She knew something was wrong before she opened the first crate. There was a sharpness beneath the cold smell, faint but present, like chemicals hiding under wet leaves. She lifted one sealed bag of greens and saw moisture gathered inside in a way that made her stomach tighten. Another bag had leaves darkening at the edges. The printed date looked acceptable, but dates were not magic. They could not tell you where food had been held, how long it had sat warm, or whether someone had cleaned a processing line properly before sealing the next shipment. Eleanor cut open one bag away from the prep table. The smell rose stronger. Not rotten exactly. Worse, clean in the wrong way. Artificial. Chemical. The kind of smell that made the old nurse inside her stand up straight. Before the cafeteria worker could talk herself into calm, she told the kitchen staff not to serve the salad. Some listened immediately because they knew Eleanor did not panic. Others froze, looking toward Marissa, because at Willowbrook, authority did not always belong to the person who knew what she was doing. Marissa arrived within minutes, irritated by the delay, and found Eleanor standing between the prep table and the trays, as if her body could become a rule no one else had the courage to write. Eleanor explained what she had found. She asked that the greens be pulled and the supplier contacted. She asked for the nurse to be alerted, not because children were sick yet, but because prevention was always quieter than rescue. Marissa saw only disruption. There were guests on campus. There were parents touring the cafeteria. There were board members coming through in less than an hour. The healthy lunch program was part of that day's presentation. A missing salad would raise questions. Questions would lead to explanations. Explanations would lead to Marissa's supplier contract. And the one thing people like Marissa feared more than danger was inconvenience that pointed upward. So the salad stayed. Not all of it. Eleanor managed to keep several trays back. She quietly removed portions from the line whenever she could. She warned 2 staff members to watch for stomach pain, dizziness, rash, or breathing trouble. She slipped safe fruit to Caleb instead of the prepared cup from the new delivery. But a cafeteria is not a battlefield one person can control forever. Lunch service moved quickly. Children laughed, trays slid forward, teachers hurried them along, and the adults who should have stopped everything chose not to see the old woman trying to hold back a tide with her hands. The first child became sick before the lunch period ended. A little girl near the 3rd grade table put her head down and said her stomach hurt. A teacher assumed she had eaten too fast. Then another child began sweating. Then a boy near the window vomited into his lap and started crying from embarrassment before fear caught up with him. Eleanor heard the change in the room before anyone named it. The pitch of children's voices shifted. The air tightened. Chairs scraped. A teacher called for the nurse. Then Caleb Morrison began to wheeze. That sound cut through Eleanor like a blade sharpened years ago. She moved before anyone told her to. The lunch line, the uniforms, the years away from the hospital, the way people underestimated her, all of it fell away. What remained was training, memory, and the terrible clarity of a child who could not breathe. She reached Caleb before the teacher beside him understood the danger. She knew where his emergency medication was supposed to be. She knew the difference between panic and an airway closing. She knew to keep him upright, to watch his lips, to keep the crowd back, to make someone call emergency services with specific words instead of useless panic. And while everyone else saw chaos, Eleanor saw categories. The children with stomach symptoms, the children with rash, the children with breathing trouble, the ones who had eaten salad, the ones who had only taken fruit, the ones who needed immediate transport, the ones who could wait under observation. She began giving instructions in a voice so steady that adults obeyed, before remembering they did not think of her as important. For several minutes, Willowbrook Academy was no longer run by its principal, its operations director, or its board. It was run by the lunch lady. By the time ambulances arrived, Eleanor had written times in her notebook, with hands that did not shake until later. She had marked Caleb's reaction. She had listed the children who ate from the suspect trays. She had kept one sealed bag aside and hidden it in the back of the refrigerator, because she no longer trusted the people who had ignored her warning to preserve the evidence. Then, Preston Vale entered the cafeteria. He did not see what Eleanor had prevented. He saw what could destroy him. Children were crying. Teachers were pale. Parents on the campus tour were being hurried away by staff who smiled too hard. Paramedics moved in and out. Marissa stood near the kitchen entrance, white-faced, already calculating which version of the story would save her. Eleanor looked at the principal and knew, before he spoke, that he was not searching for the truth. He was searching for a place to put the blame. By late afternoon, the first message went out to parents. It spoke of a possible food safety incident. It promised full cooperation with authorities. It assured families that Willowbrook's leadership was taking immediate action. Eleanor read none of it. She was still at the school, sitting alone in the cafeteria after the last ambulance left, staring at the empty tables where children had been laughing only hours before. Marissa came for the notebook first. Not openly, not with accusation. She approached Eleanor with a careful softness that made the old nurse in her colder than anger ever could. She suggested that all personal notes from the incident should be turned over to administration for proper documentation. She spoke as if the notebook were school property, as if Eleanor's observations belonged to the very people who had ignored them. Eleanor did not hand it over. That was the moment Marissa's face changed. Only for a second. But Eleanor saw it. By evening, parents were at the hospital. Rumors had reached local news. Willowbrook's board was demanding answers. The supplier had stopped returning calls. And somewhere between the first parent's accusation and the first reporter's camera outside the school gates, Preston Vale made his decision. The story would not be about ignored warnings. It would not be about a cheaper supplier. It would not be about a director of operations who had pushed unsafe food through lunch service because appearances mattered more than caution. It would be about Eleanor May Carter, the old cafeteria worker, the woman with no powerful family, no expensive lawyer, no title that sounded impressive on television, the woman who had spent 12 years feeding children and one terrible afternoon saving them. When Eleanor arrived at school the next morning, the cafeteria door was locked. 2 administrators were waiting for her. They did not shout. Willowbrook rarely shouted. They told her she had been placed on leave pending investigation. They asked her not to speak with parents. They told her the gymnasium meeting would allow the school community to receive an appropriate update. They said her presence would be required. Required. That was the word they used. Not invited. Not protected. Not represented. Required. Eleanor looked through the small window in the cafeteria door. Inside, the counters had been scrubbed too clean. The trash had been removed. The trays were gone. The refrigerator where she had hidden the sealed bag was marked with a maintenance notice. The kitchen already looked like a room being taught how to lie. For the first time since the children got sick, Eleanor felt fear. Not for herself. She had survived worse than humiliation. She had stood beside death and kept working. She had lived long enough to know that reputation could be ruined by people who never once looked you in the eye. She was afraid because she understood what Willowbrook was about to do. If they could make everyone believe she was careless, then no one would ask why her warning had been ignored. If they could make parents hate her, then parents would stop looking upward. If they could turn the lunch lady into the villain, the school could present itself as the victim of one employee's negligence. And the children would never know who had truly put them in danger. So Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and touched the notebook. Inside were the names, the times, the symptoms, the warnings, the details no administrator had bothered to learn. It was not enough yet. She knew that. A notebook could be dismissed as self-protection. An old woman's notes could be called confusion, panic, even guilt. People with power knew how to make truth look small. But Eleanor also knew something they did not. Willowbrook had cameras in places administrators forgot about. Student cameras, media club cameras, old hallway cameras no one checked unless a trophy went missing or a donor's child complained. And the day before the poisoning, Eleanor had seen a red recording light blinking above the cafeteria service hall. She did not know what it had captured. Not yet. But she knew the truth had a way of surviving in corners powerful people forgot to clean. That morning, as she walked toward the gymnasium where hundreds of angry parents waited for someone to blame, Eleanor did not look like a woman preparing to fight. She looked like a tired cafeteria worker in a faded uniform, carrying nothing but an old notebook and 12 years of being underestimated. And that was exactly why Preston Vale believed she would be easy to destroy. The gymnasium at Willowbrook Academy had been designed for celebration. It was where the school held award ceremonies, scholarship announcements, basketball victories, choir performances, and the kind of polished assemblies that made parents believe their children were growing up inside an institution built on honor. The banners hanging from the walls spoke of excellence, leadership, integrity, and service. The floor had been polished that morning until the overhead lights reflected against it like glass. Rows of chairs faced a temporary podium, and behind that podium stood a long table covered in white cloth, with sealed lunch trays placed in a careful line. To the parents, those trays looked like evidence. To Eleanor, they looked like children. She could not look at them without seeing Caleb Morrison's small hand gripping the edge of the cafeteria table, without hearing the first wet gasp in his throat, without remembering the little girl who had tried to apologize after vomiting because she thought she had done something wrong. Food should never have become a thing children feared. A lunch tray should have been ordinary, forgettable, safe. That was the part that hurt Eleanor most. Not the whispers, not the stares, not even the way 2 administrators had walked beside her as if she were already dangerous. It was the knowledge that someone had taken something as simple as lunch and allowed greed to make it unsafe. When she entered the gym, the sound changed. Not silence exactly. Silence would have been kinder. What came over the room was a tightening, a collective intake of anger that had been waiting for a face. Parents turned in their chairs. Some had red eyes from hospital nights. Some held phones in their hands, recording before anything had been said. Some looked exhausted, frightened, and desperate enough to believe the first explanation offered to them, because uncertainty is a cruel thing to leave beside a child's hospital bed. Eleanor understood their anger. That was what made it harder. She knew what it was to sit beside a child and bargained silently with God, medicine, time, and memory. She knew what fear could do to a parent. Fear could make a kind person brutal. It could make a thoughtful person hungry for punishment before truth had even arrived. She did not hate the parents for looking at her that way, but she did hate the people who had pointed them in her direction. Principal Preston Vale stood at the podium in a dark suit, his face arranged into solemn concern. Beside him sat two members of the board, Marissa Lang, and the school's attorney, a narrow man who kept his hands folded as if stillness could make him seem trustworthy. The school nurse sat farther down the row, pale and uncomfortable, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's for reasons that looked less like guilt than fear. Eleanor noticed that immediately. The nurse had tried to raise concerns after the first memo. Eleanor knew that. Now she was sitting behind the same table as the people who had ignored her, and her silence looked like a bruise. Preston began by thanking parents for their patience during what he called a deeply painful incident. He spoke of the school's responsibility to protect every child and promised that Willowbrook would cooperate fully with health officials. His voice had the slow weight of practiced grief. He paused in the right places. He lowered his eyes when mentioning the children in hospital care. He used words like accountability and transparency, though he had chosen that morning to lock the cafeteria before Eleanor could enter it. Then he turned slightly toward her. He did not say outright that she had poisoned anyone. He was too careful for that. Men like Preston did not place blame with a hammer when a silk cord would do. He spoke instead of preliminary concerns, of food handling irregularities, of deviations from established procedures, of an employee whose personal notes suggested she had acted outside approved protocol. He made Eleanor's notebook sound suspicious without showing anyone what was inside it. He made her caution sound like incompetence. He made her refusal to surrender her notes sound like obstruction. Eleanor stood near the side of the gym, not at the table, not among the staff, not given a chair. That detail was not accidental. It placed her where the parents could see her as separate from the institution. Willowbrook was the school. Preston was the leadership. Marissa was operations. The board was oversight. Eleanor was the failure. A mother in the second row began crying before Preston finished. A father shouted that his son had been taken by ambulance, and no one from the school had told him the truth. Another parent demanded to know whether Eleanor had prepared the food herself. Someone else asked why an older cafeteria worker had been allowed to manage children's meals without supervision. The questions did not wait for answers. They came like stones, thrown by people who had been handed a target. Preston let it happen long enough to be useful. Then he raised his hand, not to protect Eleanor, but to appear reasonable while she absorbed the room's fury. He assured the parents that Willowbrook had already placed the employee most closely connected to lunch service on administrative leave. He promised that further action would be taken if negligence was confirmed. He did not mention Eleanor's memo. He did not mention the supplier change. He did not mention that the salad had been questioned before service. He did not mention that Eleanor had been the one to organize the children by symptoms, while everyone else panicked. Marissa sat very still. That was how Eleanor knew she was frightened. People like Marissa moved constantly when they felt safe. They adjusted tablets, touched folders, corrected chairs, polished appearances. But fear had made her quiet. Her eyes kept sliding toward Eleanor's apron pocket, where the notebook rested beneath the faded cloth. The whole room believed Eleanor's silence was weakness. Marissa knew better. She knew Eleanor had written things down. Hannah Morrison was in the third row. Eleanor had seen her before the meeting began, sitting with her hands clasped, so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Caleb was still in the hospital, stable but weak. His breathing improved but not yet normal. Hannah looked smaller than she had at morning drop-off, as if one night of terror had taken weight from her bones. When her eyes met Eleanor's, there was pain in them, but not the same kind of hatred Eleanor saw on other faces. Hannah was a nurse's aide. She knew enough about emergencies to have heard something in the hospital reports that did not fit the story the school was telling. But knowing something does not always give a person the courage to say it in a room full of power. So Hannah looked away. Eleanor did not blame her. The meeting might have ended there if Preston had not grown too confident. He had planned to present concern, promise investigation, and leave Eleanor suspended in public suspicion long enough for the board to manage the story. But anger, once gathered, demands a sacrifice. A father stood and said that leave was not enough. Another parent demanded that Eleanor apologize. Someone else used the word criminal, and the room seized on it because fear loves language that makes uncertainty feel resolved. Preston hesitated, only for a moment. Then he looked toward the school attorney, then toward Marissa, and made a choice that revealed him more clearly than any confession could have. He asked Eleanor to address the families, not to defend herself properly, not to present evidence, not to explain the warning. He invited her to express remorse for the pain the community was experiencing. It was a careful phrase, polished enough to look humane and sharp enough to cut. If Eleanor apologized, they would treat it like guilt. If she refused, they would call her cold. Every parent turned toward her. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt the full weight of being old, poor, and alone in a room that had already chosen its version of events. Her hands remained folded, but inside one palm, her fingers pressed against the edge of the notebook through her apron. She thought of the children. She thought of the sealed bag hidden in the refrigerator. She thought of Caleb's airway narrowing beneath her hands. She thought of the memo she had written and the way important people had ignored it because her uniform made her easy to dismiss. She did not apologize for a thing she had not done, but she did speak. She spoke slowly, in the kind of voice that made the nearest rows quiet without knowing why. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She did not explain her nursing history or plead for respect. She said, in essence, that the children deserved the truth more than they deserved a fast answer. She said the food should not have been served. She said she had warned the appropriate staff. She said the sick children had not all eaten the same portions, and that distinction mattered. She said the records in her notebook were meant to help doctors, not protect herself. A few parents stopped shouting, not because they believed her yet, but because truth sometimes has a different rhythm than performance. Preston felt that shift and stepped in quickly. He reminded the room that official investigators would determine facts and that unverified claims from an employee under review should not distract from the school's process. The word process did heavy work for him. It sounded responsible while burying the fact that his process had begun with hiding the woman who knew the timeline best. Marissa stood then, unable to sit still any longer. She spoke about standardized supply checks, approved vendors, and the importance of not spreading misinformation during a crisis. She suggested that the kitchen had experienced confusion because certain staff members resisted updated procedures. She did not say Eleanor's name every time, but she did not need to. Every sentence pointed like a finger. That was when the school nurse finally looked up. Her name was Diane Mercer, and until that moment, she had seemed folded into herself. Eleanor watched her eyes move from Marissa to the sealed trays, then to the parents, then down to her own hands. Diane had been trained to care for children, but institutions have a way of teaching caring people to fear paperwork more than danger. Eleanor knew that fear. She had seen it in hospitals too. A person does not always become complicit because she is cruel. Sometimes she becomes complicit because she believes the truth will cost her job, and her job is the only way she feeds her family. Diane did not speak in that meeting, but she began to cry. It was small, controlled, nearly hidden. Yet Eleanor saw it, and Marissa saw Eleanor seeing it. After the meeting, the room did not empty so much as break apart. Parents clustered in angry groups. Reporters outside the doors tried to catch anyone willing to speak. Board members vanished behind administrators. Preston moved through the gym like a shepherd of damage, placing hands on shoulders, promising updates, making grief feel attended to while guiding it safely away from himself. Eleanor was escorted toward a side hallway. Marissa followed. There were no parents here, no cameras, no board members. The hallway smelled of varnish and old basketballs. Sunlight came through a narrow window high on the wall. In that smaller space, Marissa's politeness fell away like a costume she was tired of wearing. She told Eleanor that the notebook needed to be turned over immediately. She said investigators would view the refusal badly. She said the school could not guarantee support for an employee who appeared to be withholding relevant information. Support. The word almost made Eleanor smile. Willowbrook had placed her before a room full of furious parents, implied her guilt, locked her out of her own kitchen, and begun rewriting the incident before the children had fully recovered. Now, Marissa was offering support in exchange for the only record she had not controlled. Eleanor kept the notebook. Marissa's face hardened. She warned that old notes made in panic could be misunderstood. She suggested Eleanor might not remember the timeline correctly. She mentioned age without saying the word too directly. She implied confusion, fatigue, emotional distress, all the soft weapons used against older women when their clarity becomes inconvenient. Eleanor had heard every version before. In hospitals, patients were called confused when they were inconvenient. Mothers were called hysterical when they were right. Nurses were called difficult when they noticed the doctor had missed something. People in authority rarely admitted they feared truth. They called it disorder. So Eleanor left with the notebook still in her pocket. By that evening, her name was everywhere. Not in the way a name is honored, in the way a name is dragged. Local news referred to her as the cafeteria worker at the center of the Willowbrook food crisis. Social media did what social media always did when given fear, a photograph, and no patience. Parents shared old pictures from school events, zooming in on Eleanor behind lunch tables, as if her faded uniform had always been evidence of danger. Strangers who had never met her wrote that schools should not trust low-level workers with children's food. One post claimed she had been careless for years. Another suggested she had probably been hiding health problems. People who knew nothing spoke with the confidence of those who would never have to repair what they damaged. Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table that night, with the television off and the notebook open in front of her. Her house was modest, narrow, and quiet. The wallpaper had faded near the window. A kettle sat on the stove. On one shelf were framed photographs from a life Willowbrook had never asked about. Eleanor in blue scrubs beside other nurses at St. Agnes. Eleanor holding a certificate for 20 years of emergency service. Eleanor with her late husband at a picnic. Eleanor standing beside a young girl whose name she still could not say, without feeling the old wound move. None of those pictures mattered to the people calling her careless. They had seen a hairnet and decided that was the whole story. She copied her notebook pages onto clean paper in case the original disappeared. Old habits, hospital habits. Never keep only one record when someone powerful wants the record gone. The next morning, the health department arrived at Willowbrook. Eleanor was not allowed inside during the inspection. She waited across the street near the bus stop, watching men and women in plain coats enter through the cafeteria loading door. Marissa greeted them with professional concern. Preston stood nearby, speaking gravely. The sealed trays from the gymnasium were carried out. The refrigerator was opened. The trash bins had already been emptied the day before. The hidden bag was gone. Eleanor knew before anyone told her. There are losses a person feels in the body before evidence confirms them. The sealed bag she had placed behind the older milk crates, the one with the strange chemical smell, the one thing that might have tied the symptoms directly to the supplier, had disappeared. Later, when an investigator asked whether she had preserved any physical sample, Eleanor described where it had been placed. The investigator checked. Nothing. The maintenance notice was gone too. Marissa had cleaned the corner. Powerful people forgot only after realizing Eleanor had remembered it. That should have broken her. Instead, it made something inside Eleanor settle. By trying to erase the evidence, Marissa had confirmed there was evidence worth erasing. The hospital became the place where the truth began to breathe again. Caleb Morrison woke more fully on the second day. His voice was weak. His throat hurt. His mother sat beside him with circles under her eyes and one hand resting lightly on his blanket, as if she feared that if she stopped touching him, the world might take him again. A pediatric specialist explained reactions, exposure, and the need for follow-up testing. The language was careful, medical, incomplete. But Caleb, in the simple, broken way children remember terror, said enough to make Hannah go still. He remembered Eleanor telling him not to take the salad. He remembered her putting a safe fruit cup on his tray instead. He remembered a teacher hurrying the line. He remembered the lady from the office telling Eleanor that lunch had to keep moving. Most importantly, he remembered Eleanor kneeling beside him when he could not breathe, telling the adults what medicine he needed before anyone else could find the form. Hannah did not know the whole truth yet, but she knew enough to understand that the woman being blamed on the news had not behaved like the source of danger. She had behaved like the only adult who knew what danger looked like. That night, Hannah called the school nurse. Diane Mercer did not answer at first. She let the call go to voicemail. Then guilt did what fear had failed to do, and she called back from her car in the parking lot of a grocery store, where no one from Willowbrook could overhear her. Hannah told her what Caleb remembered. Diane listened, crying before the story ended. Then Diane admitted what she had not been brave enough to say in the gym. Eleanor had come to her with concerns days before the incident. Diane had forwarded them to administration. She had asked whether the new supplier should be reviewed. The answer had come back wrapped in polite dismissal. Food service compliance was being handled by operations. No further action was necessary. Staff should avoid creating unnecessary alarm. Unnecessary alarm. That was what they had called the warning before the ambulances came. Hannah asked if Diane would say that publicly. Diane did not answer quickly. Fear returned, practical and heavy. A job, insurance, children of her own, a mortgage. The machinery of silence is rarely built from evil alone. Often it is built from ordinary needs pressed against a powerful institution. But by the end of the call, Diane agreed to do one thing. She would look for the email trail. If it still existed, she would save it somewhere safe. The first crack appeared. The second came from a student no one had thought to notice. Her name was Lena Ortiz, a sophomore in Willowbrook's media club. She was quiet, observant, and more comfortable behind cameras than in front of people. She had been working on a student documentary about the hidden workers of the school, a project her advisor had approved because it sounded harmless and wholesome. The janitors, the groundskeeper, the cafeteria staff, the bus drivers, the people who made Willowbrook function while the school's public image centered on donors, administrators, and award-winning students. Lena had interviewed Eleanor the week before the poisoning. Not a formal interview. Eleanor had not liked the idea of being filmed, but Lena had set up small cameras in the service hallway to capture background footage of the cafeteria opening before lunch. She wanted to show hands preparing food, trays being arranged, the rhythm of work most students never saw. One camera had been mounted above the service hall near the loading entrance, old equipment borrowed from the media closet, connected to a portable drive because the school's main system was unreliable there. After the poisoning, Marissa ordered all student media related to the cafeteria deleted until the investigation ended. Lena obeyed at first. She was 15. Institutions count on that. They count on young people believing obedience is the same as goodness. She deleted the project folder from the media club computer while her hands shook. She told herself it was not her place. She told herself adults knew what they were doing. She told herself the footage was probably unimportant. Then she saw Eleanor on the news, not the Eleanor who had spoken to her about how some children were too proud to admit they were hungry, not the woman who had laughed softly when Lena asked why she wrote names in a notebook. The news showed Eleanor as a suspect, a gray-haired cafeteria worker under investigation. It used a picture cropped from a school event where Eleanor stood in the background, half blurred, half accused. Something about that made Lena sick. So she checked the backup drive. The deleted folder was gone from the computer, but the camera had saved raw files onto the portable drive before syncing. Lena found hours of ordinary footage first. Empty hallway, delivery carts, Eleanor wiping counters, staff moving in and out, nothing dramatic. Then she found the morning of the poisoning. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. There was no sound in part of the footage, only movement. Eleanor at the loading door, opening a crate, pausing. Eleanor calling over another staff member. Eleanor setting aside several bags. Marissa entering the frame. The two women facing each other near the prep table. Marissa's posture sharp. Eleanor standing still. Then Marissa pointing toward the lunch line. A staff member reluctantly lifting the bags Eleanor had set aside. Trays moving forward. Lena watched it 3 times. On the 4th viewing, she noticed something else. A second camera from the side hallway had captured audio in fragments. Not enough for every word. Enough for meaning. Eleanor's voice was low, warning that the greens smelled wrong and should not be served. Marissa's voice was clearer, impatient, saying the inspection was already approved and lunch could not be disrupted because visitors were on campus. The exact words were broken by kitchen noise, but the shape of the truth survived. Lena sat alone in the media room long after school ended, staring at the screen while the building settled into evening creaks around her. She was 15 years old, and she understood enough to be afraid. Because the footage did not only prove Eleanor had warned them, it proved the school had lied after children got sick. Lena tried to tell her media advisor first. Mr. Alvarez was a good teacher, tired in the way good teachers often are when they work in places that celebrate student voice only until it becomes inconvenient. He watched the footage without speaking. His face changed slowly, the way a person's face changes when the safe choice and the right choice move in opposite directions. He told Lena not to upload anything. She thought he was choosing the school. Then he took the portable drive, made 2 copies, gave one back to her, and told her to go straight home. His hands were shaking when he did it. That frightened her more than if he had shouted. Adults only tremble around truth when they know it can cost them something. By the next morning, Willowbrook's story was beginning to fray, though Preston Vale did not know it yet. He was preparing the final version. The board wanted closure. The donor families wanted reassurance. The health department was moving too slowly for the school's public relations team. Parents were angry, but anger without direction could turn upward, if not carefully managed. Preston needed a decisive act, something that made Willowbrook look strong, not cruel. Strong, accountable, protective. So he scheduled an emergency board meeting and invited selected parents. The agenda was not sent to Eleanor, but she learned of it through Diane Mercer, who called from a number Eleanor did not recognize and spoke with the fragile urgency of a woman trying to do the right thing before fear talked her out of it. Diane had found the emails, Eleanor's memo, Diane's forwarded concern, Marissa's dismissal. Preston copied on the thread. It was not everything, but it was enough to show the warning had not disappeared. Hannah Morrison called next. Her voice was different from the one Eleanor remembered from the lunch line. Harder, yes, but not against Eleanor anymore, against the lie. Caleb had repeated the same memory to a doctor, and the doctor had documented it. Hannah did not ask Eleanor whether she had saved her son. She said she knew. Those words nearly undid Eleanor. Not because she needed praise. Praise had always made her uncomfortable. It was simply the first time since the gymnasium that someone had looked at the truth and not turned away. Still, Eleanor knew pieces were not enough. A child's memory could be challenged. Emails could be explained away. A notebook could be dismissed. People like Preston and Marissa had spent their lives turning evidence into uncertainty whenever certainty threatened them. Then Mr. Alvarez came to her house. He arrived after dark, rain shining on his jacket, holding a small padded envelope like it contained something heavier than plastic and wires. Lena waited in his car, visible through the windshield, her face pale and determined. Mr. Alvarez did not make a speech. He did not pretend bravery felt clean. He admitted that he had almost stayed silent. He admitted that Willowbrook could ruin a teacher quietly, without ever using the word punishment. Then he placed the envelope on Eleanor's kitchen table. Inside was the drive. Eleanor did not watch the footage right away. She simply looked at it. This small, ordinary object that had survived deletion, obedience, panic, and the arrogance of people who believed anything not under their control did not matter. The truth had been recorded by a child trying to make a school project about invisible workers. There was a kind of justice in that so precise, it almost hurt. The emergency board meeting was set for the following afternoon. Preston believed it would end with Eleanor's termination, a carefully worded apology to parents, and a promise of improved oversight. Marissa believed the missing food sample and cleaned kitchen had removed the worst of her risk. The board believed money could repair reputation if blame was assigned quickly enough. None of them knew that Hannah Morrison would be there with Caleb's documented statement. None of them knew Diane Mercer had saved the email chain. None of them knew Lena Ortiz had kept a second copy. And none of them knew that Eleanor May Carter, the lunch lady they had blamed for poisoning children, would walk into that boardroom not with anger, not with revenge, but with the calm of a woman who had spent her life reading vital signs and knew exactly when a failing body was about to reveal the truth. By the time Eleanor May Carter arrived at the emergency board meeting, Willowbrook Academy had already prepared the ending it wanted. The conference room had been arranged with the quiet elegance of an institution trying to look calm while standing beside a fire it had helped start. A long, polished table ran through the center of the room. Water glasses had been placed in front of every leather chair. Folders were stacked neatly at each seat, filled with carefully chosen summaries, legal language, parent updates, and a draft statement that no one had shown Eleanor. Through the tall windows, the campus looked almost peaceful. Children moved between buildings, under the watch of teachers pretending the world had not shifted beneath them. The stone walkways were clean, the flower beds were trimmed. The front of Willowbrook still looked like a place where nothing ugly could survive. But truth does not care how polished a table is. Eleanor stood near the end of that room, in her same faded cafeteria uniform. She had been told she could attend, because the matter concerned her employment. But the chair reserved for her had been placed away from the board members, away from the school attorney, and away from the center of conversation. It was the same strategy they had used in the gymnasium, only quieter. Put the woman apart. Make her look like the problem instead of the witness. Let wealth, titles, and architecture do what accusation could not. Principal Preston Vale sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, his expression solemn but controlled. Marissa Lang sat to his right, wearing a pale blouse and the brittle confidence of someone who had spent the night convincing herself the worst evidence had disappeared. Board members murmured to one another in low voices. A few selected parents had been invited, though invited was too generous a word for what had happened. The parents chosen were those the school believed could be managed: donors, alumni, people who knew the value of discretion, people who understood that reputation was a kind of currency. But Hannah Morrison was there too. That had not been part of Preston's plan. She sat near the far side of the room, with a hospital bracelet still around her wrist from staying beside Caleb. She looked exhausted, but exhaustion had burned away her fear. The night before, she had listened to her son describe Eleanor's hands, Eleanor's voice, Eleanor's instructions, and the safe fruit cup that had been placed on his tray. A mother could misunderstand many things in grief, but she could not misunderstand the moment her child told her who had tried to protect him. Diane Mercer, the school nurse, sat 2 seats away from Hannah with a folder clutched in her lap. Her face was pale, but she had come. That alone mattered. Fear had kept her silent in the gym, but shame had followed her home, sat with her through the night, and refused to leave. By morning, she had printed the emails, saved them twice, and understood that silence was no longer self-protection. It was participation. Near the back of the room stood Mr. Alvarez from the media department. Beside him was Lena Ortiz, a 15-year-old student with anxious eyes and a backpack held tightly in front of her. She had not been invited either, not officially. But truth often enters important rooms through doors no one thought to lock. Preston began the meeting with sorrow. That was always his first move. He thanked the board, the parents, the school staff, and the health officials for their cooperation. He spoke of the children still recovering, of the emotional difficulty facing the Willowbrook community, of the need for decisive action. He never said Eleanor's name at first. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew where the sentence was headed before it arrived. The school attorney then summarized the internal review in language polished enough to hide its emptiness. There had been inconsistencies in cafeteria procedure. There had been concerns regarding documentation. There had been an employee who had acted outside proper channels during and after the incident. No one at the table said the word scapegoat, but that was the shape of every sentence. Eleanor could hear the machinery turning. It was not looking for truth. It was building a bridge away from liability. Then Preston finally looked at her. He spoke with sadness in his voice, as if firing her would hurt him more than it hurt the woman whose name had been dragged across the news. He said Willowbrook had a duty to restore trust. He said the school could not move forward, while serious questions remained about the conduct of its food service staff. He said the board would be asked to approve Eleanor May Carter's termination, effective immediately, while further legal questions were handled through appropriate channels. There it was, the ending they had written for her. Eleanor did not move. She had spent enough years in emergency rooms to know that some moments required stillness. Panic wasted oxygen. Anger blurred the edges of useful detail. In a crisis, one had to listen past the noise and wait for the vital sign that mattered. The first vital sign came from Hannah Morrison. Her voice was not loud, but it changed the room because it carried the weight of a mother who had almost lost her son. She asked whether the board had reviewed Caleb's hospital statement. Preston's face tightened slightly, then relaxed into concern. He said the school respected all family experiences and would cooperate fully with medical documentation. It was an answer designed to sound complete while saying nothing. Hannah did not let it pass. She explained that Caleb remembered Eleanor warning him away from the salad. He remembered her giving him a safe fruit cup. He remembered her recognizing his breathing trouble before anyone else understood what was happening. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Powerful people rarely shift dramatically when their version of events is threatened. They adjust posture. They glance at attorneys. They look down at papers they have already read. But Eleanor saw it. The certainty around the table had lost its first layer. Marissa responded before Preston could. She suggested that children recovering from medical distress could remember events imperfectly. She said Caleb had been frightened. She said the school could not build conclusions around a child's fragmented memory. Her tone was careful, almost sympathetic, but the meaning was cold. Caleb's memory was useful when the school needed parents' fear. It became unreliable the moment it pointed away from Eleanor. That was when Diane Mercer opened her folder. She did not look like a brave woman in that moment. Brave people in stories often stand tall, speak clearly, and appear transformed. Real bravery is messier. Diane's fingers trembled. Her voice caught at first. She looked as if every sentence had to pass through the weight of her mortgage, her job, and the children she supported before it could reach the room. But she spoke anyway. She confirmed that Eleanor had raised concerns before the poisoning. She confirmed that Eleanor had documented symptoms and supplier concerns. She confirmed that Eleanor's memo had been forwarded to administration, including Marissa Lang and Principal Vale. She explained that she had been told not to create unnecessary alarm. Unnecessary alarm. The words hung in the room with a cruelty that needed no embellishment. For the first time, Preston stopped looking sorrowful and began looking careful. Marissa's face lost color. The school attorney leaned toward the principal and whispered something behind one hand. A board member asked whether the email chain existed. Diane placed printed copies on the table. Eleanor watched the papers move from hand to hand. They were not dramatic. They did not glow with justice. They were simply printed emails, black ink on white paper. But sometimes the plainest evidence is the most dangerous because it refuses to be turned into metaphor. There were dates, there were names, there were warnings, there was acknowledgement, there was dismissal. Preston tried to regain the room. He thanked Diane for clarifying the timeline and suggested the emails would be reviewed in the proper context. He said staff concerns were often evaluated alongside vendor certifications, budgetary needs, and professional compliance standards. The words were smooth, but they no longer landed the same way. Once a lie has cracked, every polished sentence sounds like someone stepping around broken glass. Then Mr. Alvarez stepped forward. Preston looked genuinely irritated now. Not frightened yet. Irritated. A media teacher and a student were not supposed to matter in a boardroom filled with donors, attorneys, and administrators. They belonged to the softer parts of the school, the parts used for brochures and student showcases, not institutional survival. But Mr. Alvarez placed a small drive on the table, and for the first time that day, Marissa looked truly afraid. He explained that, as part of a student documentary project, cameras had been recording in the cafeteria service hallway on the morning of the incident. He explained that the footage had been ordered deleted after the crisis. He explained that a backup existed. No one spoke for several seconds. It was one thing to deny memory. It was another to deny a camera. Marissa said immediately that any unauthorized recording would violate school policy. The speed of her response betrayed her. She had not asked what was on the footage. She had not asked whether it might help the children. She had reached first for policy, the favorite shield of people who fear evidence more than misconduct. Lena Ortiz spoke then, not loudly, but clearly enough for every adult in the room to hear. She explained that the project had been approved. The camera placement had been approved. The hallway had been used only to film cafeteria operations for a student feature about workers whose labor often went unseen. She looked toward Eleanor only once, and in that glance was an apology too heavy for a 15-year-old to carry. Eleanor wanted to tell her she had done enough, more than enough. But this was not the moment. The board chair ordered the footage played. Preston objected through the attorney. The attorney suggested a private review. Hannah insisted that the parents deserved to see what the school had already tried to hide. Diane placed her printed emails beside the drive. Mr. Alvarez connected the file to the room's display system with hands steadier than his face. The screen lit up. At first, the footage looked ordinary. A cafeteria service hallway before lunch, delivery crates near the loading door, staff moving in and out. Eleanor entering the frame in her faded uniform, carrying no authority anyone at Willowbrook had ever respected. She opened a crate. She paused. She leaned closer. Even without sound, the room could see the moment her body understood something was wrong. Then the second camera angle appeared, with broken audio. Eleanor's voice came through low and grainy, warning that the green smelled wrong and should not be served. Kitchen noise swallowed some words, but not enough. Marissa entered the frame. Her posture was sharp. Her voice carried more clearly than Eleanor's, telling staff that lunch could not be disrupted, that the supplier had been approved, and that visitors were on campus. The room watched Eleanor set several bags aside. Then they watched a staff member, after Marissa's order, move some of them back toward service. Hannah covered her mouth. Diane began to cry again, but this time she did not lower her head. Preston's face had gone still, in the way faces go still when every expression becomes dangerous. The footage continued. The first child became sick, then another. The camera did not capture every table, but it captured enough of the service area to show confusion spreading. Teachers moved without direction. Staff looked toward administrators who were not there. Then Eleanor re-entered the frame, and the room changed as it watched her. She was not panicking. She was not hiding. She was not acting like someone who had caused harm and wished to escape it. She moved with purpose. She pointed staff toward certain tables. She separated trays. She sent someone toward the nurse's office. She took notes. She looked at children's faces, not as a cafeteria worker guessing, but as a medical professional reading symptoms. When Caleb appeared at the edge of the footage, small and struggling, Eleanor reached him before the adults around him understood what his body was saying. The audio caught fragments, enough to hear her instruct someone to call emergency services, enough to hear her identify breathing trouble, enough to hear her ask for Caleb's medication, enough to hear her keeping her voice steady when everyone else was beginning to unravel. In that boardroom, the word lunch lady began to collapse under the weight of what it had failed to see. The footage ended after the ambulances arrived. No one moved. There are silences that feel empty, and there are silences that feel full of things finally becoming undeniable. This was the second kind. Every person in the room had entered with a story ready to accept. Eleanor had been careless. Eleanor had failed. Eleanor had poisoned the children. The footage did not merely dispute that story. It reversed it so completely that the old accusation seemed obscene. The board chair asked Eleanor why she had not told them she was trained. It was a strange question, though Eleanor understood why he asked it. People with titles believe credentials are only real when displayed. They assume a person without a framed certificate on the wall must not have a history worth considering. Eleanor explained, quietly and without self-pity, that she had been an emergency nurse for 27 years before coming to Willowbrook. She had not hidden it because she was ashamed. She had simply never been asked. The school had seen a uniform and decided that was all it needed to know. That truth landed harder than accusation. Preston tried to apologize in the language of damage control. He said the school clearly needed to review its internal communication. He said mistakes had been made. He said emotions had run high. He began building a fog before the fire could reach him. But Hannah Morrison would not allow fog. She asked who had changed suppliers. She asked who ignored the memo. She asked who ordered student footage deleted. She asked why the cafeteria was locked before Eleanor could retrieve evidence. She asked whether the missing sealed food sample had been logged. With every question, Marissa grew smaller. Then Eleanor spoke again. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She explained that after the children became sick, she had preserved one sealed bag of the greens in the back of the refrigerator. She had done so because she believed investigators would need it. The next morning, after the cafeteria was locked, the bag was gone. No one had told her where it went. That was the moment Marissa Lang lost the room. Not because anyone had proven exactly what she had done yet, but because her fear became visible. She denied touching anything. Then she said many people had access. Then she said the kitchen had to be sanitized. Then she claimed she did not recall specific handling of materials during a crisis. Each answer contradicted the shape of the one before it. Truth has a gravity of its own. Once it begins pulling, lies cannot keep their balance. The board ordered an immediate preservation of all vendor records, communication logs, cleaning schedules, and supplier contracts. The attorney who had arrived ready to manage Eleanor now began advising the board to protect itself from Preston and Marissa. That was when Preston understood he was no longer the shepherd of the crisis. He was part of the flock being counted. Over the next hour, the hidden structure came apart. Marissa had pushed through the new supplier over objections from cafeteria staff. The vendor had offered significant cost reductions during a year when the board wanted to delay tuition increases. A consulting fee connected to the vendor had been routed through a small company tied to Marissa's brother-in-law. Preston had approved the arrangement without proper independent review because the savings helped support his expansion campaign and donor presentation. The food safety documents were not entirely false, but they were incomplete, outdated, and treated as sufficient by people who benefited from not looking harder. No one had intended children to be hurt. That was the defense Marissa tried to hide behind. Eleanor had heard that defense before, in hospitals, in lawsuits, in whispered hallway conversations after preventable harm. No one meant for this to happen. As if harm only counted when someone woke up and chose it directly. But children had still been placed in danger. Warnings had still been ignored. Evidence had still been removed. An innocent woman had still been offered to grieving parents as the price of protecting an institution's shine. Intent did not erase consequence. By evening, Preston Vale had been placed on administrative leave. Marissa Lang was escorted from campus, while the board contacted outside counsel and health authorities. The supplier contract was suspended. The missing food sample became part of a formal investigation. Diane's emails, Lena's footage, Hannah's statement, and Eleanor's notebook were all turned over to investigators. But this time, copies remained in hands Willowbrook could not control. The next morning, the school issued a public correction. It was not enough. Public corrections rarely are. They arrive after the damage has already run through a person's life. But it mattered. Willowbrook acknowledged that Eleanor May Carter had warned staff before lunch service that she had acted during the emergency to protect students, and that statements implying her responsibility had been premature and deeply wrong. The local news that had once displayed her photo beneath suspicion now had to say her name beside the word saved. Parents who had shouted in the gym began sending apologies. Some were sincere, some were embarrassed, some were written with the careful discomfort of people asking forgiveness without wanting to look too closely at why they had believed the worst so quickly. Eleanor read them all and answered very few. Forgiveness, she knew, was not the same thing as allowing people to skip understanding. The parents had been afraid, yes, but fear had not forced them to look down instead of up. They had chosen the easiest target because the school had placed her in front of them. Hannah Morrison came to see her in person. She brought Caleb with her once he was strong enough. He was thinner, still tired, but smiling shyly behind his round glasses. Eleanor had prepared a small container of safe cookies, though she made him check the label himself because trust should never mean surrendering caution. Hannah tried to apologize and thank her in the same breath, and both words broke under the weight of what could have happened. Eleanor accepted the thanks more easily than the apology, not because she was hard, but because she understood that Hannah's mistake had come from fear, while the school's had come from calculation. Caleb gave Eleanor a drawing. It showed the cafeteria, a tray, and a woman with gray hair standing between a child and a dark scribble labeled danger in a 7-year-old's uneven hand. Eleanor placed it on her refrigerator at home, beside old photographs from St. Agnes. For the first time in years, the memory of the child she had not been able to save did not stand alone in her heart. It stood beside Caleb, beside the children who had gone home alive, beside the terrible truth that grief and purpose can sometimes live in the same room. Willowbrook changed because it had to. Not because institutions become moral after one meeting, but because evidence makes denial expensive. The board hired an independent food safety auditor, All vendor contracts were reviewed publicly. The cafeteria staff gained authority to halt service if safety concerns arose. The school nurse's office received funding it had requested for years. Every staff member, from teachers to administrators, was required to complete emergency response training. The media club's project about invisible workers became mandatory viewing for new families, though Eleanor insisted her interview be shortened. She had never wanted to be turned into a symbol while still carrying trays. Preston Vale resigned before the investigation concluded. His public statement spoke of taking responsibility for the community's healing, but no one who had watched him in that boardroom mistook resignation for courage. Marissa faced legal consequences tied to the vendor arrangement and the missing sample. The supplier became the subject of a broader investigation after other schools quietly came forward with complaints they had been too embarrassed to admit. That was the poetic justice of it. Preston had built his image on protecting children, and he lost his position because he protected reputation instead. Marissa had treated safety as a line item, and her own paperwork became the chain that pulled her down. Willowbrook had tried to make Eleanor look like the weak link in its system, only for the world to see that she had been the one holding the system together when it failed. But Eleanor did not ask for revenge. When the board offered a settlement, she listened politely. When they offered a public ceremony, she declined the first version because it sounded too much like they wanted applause for admitting what they should never have denied. When they asked what she wanted, she gave them a list written in the same careful blue ink she had used in her notebook. Every child at Willowbrook would eat safely, regardless of income. No child would have their meal withheld, marked, or made smaller because of unpaid balances. Food suppliers would be independently inspected. Cafeteria workers would have the authority to stop service without fear of retaliation. Emergency medical information would be updated and accessible. Scholarship families would not be photographed for brochures unless they were also heard in meetings. And a fund would be created for students pursuing nursing, nutrition, public health, or emergency medicine. The board expected money to be the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was being told by the woman they had tried to destroy that safety was not a slogan. It was a practice. It was paperwork done correctly when no one was watching. It was listening to the person closest to the problem. It was believing that a cafeteria worker might know something a principal did not. It was understanding that dignity belonged as much in the lunch line as it did in the admissions office. Months later, the cafeteria at Willowbrook looked different. Not expensive. Different in the ways that mattered. The refrigerator worked properly. The loading door had a new inspection station. Ingredient lists were clear. Staff meetings included the people who actually handled the food. Diane Mercer no longer had to beg quietly for emergency updates. Lena's documentary, finished with Eleanor's reluctant permission, won a student journalism award, though Lena cared less about the award than the fact that people finally watched the kitchen without looking through it. Eleanor returned to work on a Monday. She could have retired. Many people told her she should. Some said she deserved rest. Some said the school did not deserve her. Both things were partly true. But Eleanor had learned that healing does not always mean leaving the place where you were wounded. Sometimes healing means returning with new boundaries, with the truth established, with the power to say no and be heard. When she stepped behind the serving counter, the children reacted first. They did not make speeches. Children rarely need speeches when sincerity is available. Caleb waved with both hands. A little girl asked if the soup was safe today, and Eleanor answered with the seriousness the question deserved. A boy from the scholarship program placed his tray down and told her he was glad she came back, then looked embarrassed by his own honesty. Eleanor simply added an extra roll to his plate and moved the line along. The adults were more awkward. Some avoided her eyes. Some thanked her too formally. Some apologized with voices that trembled under the weight of being wrong. Eleanor accepted what she could and let the rest pass. She had no interest in becoming cruel just because cruelty had visited her, but neither did she shrink for their comfort anymore. When a delivery arrived late and the temperature reading looked wrong, she stopped service immediately. This time, no one questioned her. Near the entrance to the cafeteria, the school placed a small plaque after weeks of debate. Eleanor refused every version that called her a hero. She said heroes were too easy for institutions to celebrate and too easy to ignore afterward. Finally, they chose words she allowed. the Carter Student Care Kitchen. Beneath that, in smaller letters, the plaque stated that no child should have to be saved by accident. On the day it was installed, Eleanor stood before it for only a moment. She thought of St. Agnes. She thought of the little boy she had not been able to save years ago, the one whose mother kept apologizing in a voice Eleanor had carried for half her life. She thought of Caleb breathing again. She thought of the children whose names filled her notebook, not as liabilities, not as data, but as lives entrusted to adults who had no right to be careless. Then she went back to work, because that was who Eleanor May Carter was. Not a woman who needed applause, not a woman who wanted revenge, not a woman whose worth began when powerful people finally recognized it. She was a caregiver, and caregivers understand something the world forgets until disaster forces it to remember. Care is not small because it happens quietly. Care is not simple because it happens every day. Care is not less important because it is done by hands wearing gloves, aprons, uniforms, or scars. At the end of that school year, Willowbrook held an assembly very different from the one that had nearly destroyed her. This time, Eleanor was not standing alone beneath bright lights while people decided her guilt. She sat near the front beside Hannah and Caleb, while Diane, Lena, Mr. Alvarez, and several cafeteria workers were recognized for changing the school's safety policies. Eleanor disliked the attention, but she tolerated it because the children were watching, and children needed to see adults admit the truth. When she was asked to speak, she kept it brief. She did not recount every injustice. She did not list every insult. She did not use the moment to humiliate those who had humiliated her. She simply reminded the room that protecting children requires more than good intentions and beautiful words. It requires listening when someone inconvenient raises a warning. It requires respecting the people closest to the work. It requires choosing truth before reputation, not after the cameras arrive. The applause that followed was not the loudest sound Eleanor remembered from Willowbrook. She remembered the first gasp of a child who could not breathe. She remembered the silence in the boardroom when the footage ended. She remembered the soft scratch of her pen as she wrote down times, symptoms, and names, while others were still trying to understand the emergency. Those were the sounds that mattered. Applause fades, records remain, children grow, systems either change or wait for the next crisis to expose them. Years later, people would tell the story in simpler ways. They would say the lunch lady was blamed and then cleared. They would say an old nurse saved the children. They would say the principal fell, the director was punished, and the school learned a lesson. But the real story was not only about one poisoning or one meeting or one hidden video. It was about the danger of judging people by the uniform that makes them useful to you. It was about institutions that call themselves excellent while ignoring the voices that keep them safe. It was about how quickly frightened people will accept a scapegoat if the truth asks them to look at someone powerful. And most of all, it was about a woman who had spent her life noticing what others missed. A strange smell beneath wet greens, a child's lips losing color, a mother too tired to fight alone, a nurse afraid to speak, a student camera blinking red in a forgotten hallway, a system trying to clean away evidence before anyone could ask why the evidence existed. Eleanor May Carter noticed all of it. So remember this, never assume the quietest person in the room knows the least. Never mistake a faded uniform for an empty history. Never believe that the people serving food, cleaning floors, driving buses, answering phones, or standing behind counters are less important than the people giving speeches about leadership. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one paying attention closely enough to save a life. And if this story made you think of someone whose quiet care was taken for granted, tell us about them in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity does not come from a title. Truth does not need permission from power, and the people we ignore may be the very people holding our children, our communities, and our future safely together.
Stay down. People like you do not get to explain first.
Most people had already decided what he was.
We already know enough.
To the store security guard, he was an easy target. To the assistant manager, he was the perfect excuse.
I knew something was wrong.
And to the shoppers passing by with their carts and baskets, He was just an uncomfortable scene they could pretend not to see.
This does not feel right.
You should have checked the cameras first.
He noticed the manager watching too carefully,
The truth is still here.
and the young cashier looking terrified because she remembered the truth.
He paid. I saw him pay.
That camera was not supposed to see that.
My version is the one they will believe.
They thought the story would end with a quiet man being blamed, embarrassed, and erased.
No receipt, no proof.
But the man on that floor had spent years protecting records from people who thought power gave them the right to rewrite reality. And before the grocery store ever learned, it had chosen the wrong man to destroy. That morning had begun in the kind of darkness most people never noticed. Not the frightening kind, not the kind that filled headlines, but the slow blue darkness before sunrise, when working people moved through the world while everyone else was still asleep. Marcus had finished mopping the fourth-floor hallway of the Bryan County Courthouse just after 5 in the morning. The courthouse was empty then, except for the hum of vending machines, the distant click of old pipes, and the soft squeak of his shoes against the marble floors. At 52, Marcus Hale had learned how to move through important buildings without being seen. He knew which doors stuck in winter, which judges arrived before sunrise, which clerks left coffee rings on polished desks, and which hallways held conversations people assumed no janitor would understand. He wore a faded charcoal hoodie over his maintenance shirt, dark work pants worn thin at the knees, and black shoes that had been repaired more times than replaced. To most people who passed him during the day, he was simply part of the building's background, like a trash bin, a mop bucket, or a light that flickered near the elevators. But Marcus had not always been invisible. Years earlier, before the courthouse had reduced him to a man with a mop, he had worked in the records division, the quiet room where evidence logs, video files, sealed documents, and time-stamped materials were handled with more care than most people ever imagined. Marcus had not been a lawyer, a judge, or a man with a title people respected in public, but he had been trusted with something more fragile than reputation. He had been trusted with the record, and to Marcus, the record was sacred. He believed a time stamp mattered. He believed a receipt mattered. He believed a camera angle, a signature, a missing minute on a file, or a note written in the margin could become the only thing standing between a person and a lie that looked official. He had seen what happened when powerful people treated paperwork like clay, shaping it until the truth became convenient. He had seen ordinary people lose jobs, children, homes, and names because someone with a cleaner suit and a louder voice wrote the first version of the story. That was why Marcus had lost his position. It had happened 7 years earlier, in a case that almost no one remembered now. A young man had claimed he had been mistreated during a detention incident, and the entire dispute came down to a hallway camera file and the time written in the evidence log. The file showed one thing. The amended report suggested another. A superior had asked Marcus to correct what they called a harmless clerical error. The tone had been casual, almost friendly, as if changing a number by 14 minutes was the same as fixing a typo. Marcus had refused. He had not shouted. He had not threatened anyone. He had simply said that the time on the file was the time on the file, and that his initials would not sit beside a lie. In a place like Bryan County, that kind of refusal did not always create a scandal. Sometimes it created something quieter and more efficient. His performance reviews changed. His attitude was questioned. His ability to work well with others became a concern. Within months, the man trusted to protect records was reassigned to building maintenance, and the courthouse learned to speak of him as difficult without ever explaining what he had been difficult about. Marcus accepted the new job because he needed to eat, because his wife Ruth needed medication, and because pride did not pay rent. But acceptance was not the same as forgetting. Every morning, as he pushed his mop past the locked records office, he remembered the kind of people who smiled while asking honest men to bend the truth. He remembered how quickly a room could turn against someone who refused to be useful to a lie. By 5:30 that morning, the first pale light had begun to press against the courthouse windows. Marcus rinsed the mop, folded the cleaning cloths, and checked the small black notebook he kept in his back pocket. It was not fancy. Its corners were soft from years of use, and its cover had been taped twice. Inside were work hours, grocery costs, medication reminders, appointment dates, and little notes written in a careful hand. Some people used phones for everything. Marcus still trusted paper, especially when paper was kept close. On the top line of that day's page, he had written Ruth's kidney appointment, Naya's birthday, and a short grocery list. Oat milk, bread, soup, apples, Ruth's prescription, blue cupcake. The cupcake mattered more than the price should have allowed. Nitya, Marcus's 12-year-old granddaughter, had asked for nothing big that year. She knew money was tight. She knew her grandmother had been tired. She knew her grandfather counted bills at the kitchen table when he thought no one was watching. So she had asked for one blue cupcake from the bakery case at the grocery store near the bus stop. The one with the bright frosting and tiny white sugar stars. Marcus had promised he would bring it home after work. That was the kind of promise a man like Marcus treated seriously. When he stepped out of the courthouse a little after 6, the town still looked half asleep. The sidewalks were wet from an overnight drizzle, and the streetlights gave the pavement a dull silver shine. Marcus pulled his hoodie tighter around his shoulders and walked toward the bus stop with the slow, careful pace of a man whose knees had carried too much for too long. He was tired, but not unhappy. There was a difference. Tired was the body asking for rest. Unhappy was the soul giving up. Marcus had not given up. At home, Ruth would still be asleep in the recliner because lying flat had become uncomfortable. Nia would be getting ready for school, pretending not to care too much about her birthday because she did not want to make anyone feel guilty. Marcus pictured the cupcake in its little plastic container, imagined placing it on the kitchen table, imagined Naya trying to hide her smile and failing. That small picture carried him through the cold morning better than coffee ever could. The grocery store was already open when he arrived. It was one of those clean, modern stores that tried to make ordinary things look expensive. The floors shone under fluorescent lights. The produce was stacked in bright pyramids. Soft music floated above the aisles, cheerful enough to make the place feel welcoming if a person did not know how quickly welcome could disappear. Marcus took a basket near the entrance and moved through the store with the careful focus of someone who knew exactly what he could spend. He chose the bread first because bread was cheaper near the back shelf. Then soup, apples, and oat milk. At the pharmacy counter, he waited quietly while a young clerk looked through the bins for Ruth's prescription. He did not complain about the wait. Marcus had spent too much of his life watching people unload their impatience onto workers who had no power over the system holding them up. When the prescription came, he checked the price, swallowed the worry it gave him, and added the receipt to his notebook. Near the bakery case, he paused longer than he meant to. The blue cupcake sat in the front row, exactly where Naya had described it, bright and almost ridiculous beneath the cold glass. For a second, Marcus felt the weight of the morning lift. It was a small thing, but small things were often where love survived when money could not do much else. He asked for one, watched it placed carefully into a little container, and paid for it separately, so it would not get crushed under the groceries. The cashier who helped him was young, with kind eyes, and the nervous energy of someone still learning how to stand up in a workplace that rewarded silence. Her name tag was there, but Marcus did not need to read it to understand her. He recognized that look, the look of a person who saw more than she said. She noticed his notebook when he tucked the receipt between the pages. She noticed that he thanked her like her work mattered. She noticed that he did not rush her, did not talk down to her, and did not treat the small transaction as beneath him. Later, that would matter. At the time, it was just another quiet kindness in a morning full of ordinary things. But from the customer service counter, Victor Rowe was watching. Victor was the assistant manager, the kind of man who had learned to make authority out of a vest and a clipped tone. He was not the owner. He was not even the store manager. But he had enough control over schedules, complaints, and shift reports to make younger employees fear him and tired customers avoid him. He liked that. It gave shape to a life that had not become as impressive as he once imagined it would. Victor had been under pressure for weeks. Inventory numbers were wrong. Premium items had gone missing. Corporate had started asking questions in careful emails that sounded polite only to people who had never been blamed for anything. Victor knew exactly why the numbers were wrong. He knew which products had been moved, which small thefts he had hidden, and which adjustments he had made to keep suspicion pointed away from himself. But pressure has a way of making dishonest people creative. He needed a story. Not a perfect story, because perfect stories invite inspection. He needed a believable one. A tired older man in worn clothes, a small basket, a separate bakery purchase, a store full of distracted shoppers, a private security lead who already believed the worst about certain people before facts arrived. To Victor, Marcus was not a customer. He was an opportunity. Marcus had no idea he had been chosen. He paid at the self-checkout for the groceries, moving slowly but carefully, scanning each item and placing it into the bagging area. The machine gave him trouble once with the apples, and he waited for assistance without irritation. The young cashier glanced over, helped clear the warning, and watched him finish the transaction. Marcus folded the receipt and placed it into his notebook with the pharmacy receipt and the bakery receipt. Then he set the cupcake on top of the bag, like something fragile enough to deserve its own space. As he turned toward the exit, Victor stepped away from the counter. The moment was almost invisible at first. A manager intercepting a customer near the front of the store was not unusual. A security lead drifting closer from the side aisle was not enough to make most people stop. Shoppers kept moving. Carts rolled. The automatic doors opened and closed with soft mechanical sighs. Everything about the scene looked normal from a distance, and that was what made it dangerous. Victor spoke with the practiced calm of a man performing concern for an audience. He suggested there had been a problem. He implied that Marcus needed to wait. He did not accuse him loudly at first. He was too careful for that. He wanted the attention to gather slowly, wanted people to see Marcus held in place before they heard why. Because once a person looks detained, the crowd begins inventing reasons. Marcus felt the change immediately. It was not fear first. It was recognition. The temperature of the room seemed to shift, not in the air, but in the way people looked at him. A woman near the cereal aisle slowed down. A man with a cart full of bottled water glanced once and then looked away. Someone whispered without knowing anything. The private security lid approached with his jaw set and his mind already made up. His name was Brent Calder, though Marcus did not know it yet. Calder had the posture of a man who believed firmness was the same as truth. He wore a plain dark security uniform, but he carried himself as if the store had given him a kingdom. He did not ask Marcus what happened. He asked Victor what the problem was, and that told Marcus everything about the direction the morning had taken. Victor produced a bag Marcus had never touched. It contained expensive items from a premium shelf, the kind of goods Marcus would not have bought even in a better month. The bag appeared from behind the counter, as if it had been waiting for its cue. Victor said enough for people nearby to understand that he believed Marcus had tried to leave without paying. He kept his voice measured, but there was satisfaction underneath it. He was not discovering a crime. He was presenting one. Marcus reached for his notebook. That small movement made Calder stiffen. The security lid told him not to reach around, not to make things harder, not to act like he could talk his way out of what they had already found. Marcus stopped, not because Calder was right, but because Marcus understood how quickly a normal gesture could be rewritten by someone determined to see danger. He kept his hands visible and explained, as calmly as he could, that he had receipts for everything he bought. But calm did not help him. Calm often angers people who depend on panic to prove their version of events. Calder wanted Marcus defensive. Victor wanted him confused. The crowd wanted him simple enough to categorize quickly. But Marcus stayed measured, and that quiet steadiness made the accusation feel less secure. So Victor added details. He mentioned the high-value items. He spoke of prior losses. He hinted that the store had been watching people like Marcus for weeks, though Marcus had never been part of any such thing. The young cashier heard that and looked up. She remembered the self-checkout. She remembered helping with the apples. She remembered the folded receipt. Her face changed with the first sharp edge of understanding, but fear held her in place. Victor controlled schedules. Victor wrote evaluations. Victor knew how to punish people without making it look like punishment. She was 19, knew and not yet sure courage would protect her from consequences. Marcus saw her hesitation and did not blame her. That was one of the things people misunderstood about the quiet. They assumed silence meant weakness or approval. But Marcus knew silence had many shapes. Some silence was cowardice. Some was survival. Some was the terrible pause before a person decided what kind of witness they were willing to become. Calder stepped closer. Victor stood behind him. The store kept moving around them, but differently now. Shoppers did not stop in a circle like people in movies. Real life was colder than that. They slowed, stared, judged, and kept shopping. A mother pulled her child gently toward another aisle. An older man pretended to compare prices on canned beans while listening to every word. A teenager lifted his phone, then lowered it when Calder looked his way. The humiliation did not need a crowd gathered tightly around it. It only needed enough people to see and choose comfort over truth. Marcus asked them to check the cameras. That should have been the simplest request in the world. In a store with cameras above registers, doors, aisles, and counters, a customer asking for footage should have sounded reasonable. But lies do not like neutral witnesses. Victor's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Calder dismissed the request as if it were a trick. He said the matter was already clear enough, and Victor nodded too quickly. Marcus noticed that too. He noticed the nod. He noticed the security lead standing between him and the exit. He noticed Victor's eyes cutting once toward the freezer aisle and then away. He noticed the young cashier pressing her lips together as if the truth were physically hurting her. Most of all, he noticed the small red light above the freezer case. It was not one of the obvious store cameras mounted in black domes from the ceiling. It was smaller, placed near a service panel, the kind installed by an outside maintenance company to monitor temperature access and after-hours service. Marcus had seen hundreds of cameras in his old job. He knew the difference between a camera controlled by a building and one maintained by a vendor. He knew that sometimes the most important witness was the one powerful people forgot existed. For the first time that morning, Victor had chosen the wrong man. Not because Marcus was rich, he was not. Not because Marcus had influence, he had very little. Not because anyone in that store was ready to protect him. Most were not. Victor had chosen the wrong man because Marcus understood records the way other people understood weather. He could feel when a story was being built against him. He knew where to look for the thing that would survive after voices finished lying. Still, knowledge did not save him from shame. Calder's voice grew harder. Victor's expression became more wounded and official, as if he were the victim of Marcus's refusal to accept guilt. The cupcake slipped from the top of the grocery bag during the confusion and landed near the wheel of a shopping cart. No one meant to crush it, or maybe no one cared enough to stop it from being crushed. The little blue frosting smeared across the clear plastic lid, and for one painful second, Marcus thought not of the accusation, not of the security guard, not of the watching shoppers, but of Nia. He had promised her. That was the detail that almost broke him. Not the embarrassment, not the way people looked at him, not even the false accusation. Marcus had survived worse things than public judgment. But the cupcake on the floor, bright blue and ruined under fluorescent light, carried a cruelty no report would ever capture. It was proof that lies do not only attack the accused, they reach outward. They touch birthdays, kitchens, sick wives, children waiting at home, and every small hope a tired person has carried through the morning. Marcus lowered his eyes, not in surrender, but to steady himself. He had learned long ago that anger, when displayed by the wrong person in the wrong room, becomes evidence for the other side. So he swallowed it. He let his breathing slow. He kept his face as calm as he could, while the people around him mistook restraint for guilt. Inside, however, he was already preserving the morning, the time, the aisle, the position of the cupcake, the order of the receipts, the camera above the freezer, the cashier's face, Victor's glance, Calder's words. A record could begin in the mind before it reached paper. By the time Marcus was finally led away from the front of the store and into the small back office, the public part of the humiliation had already done its damage. People would remember him as the man stopped near the exit. Some would tell themselves they had seen stolen goods, though they had only seen a bag Victor produced. Others would remember the security guard's confidence and mistake it for proof. A few would feel uneasy later, maybe while unloading groceries at home. But uneasiness was not the same as testimony. In the back office, Victor's performance changed. Without the shoppers nearby, His concern became impatience. Calder began writing an internal incident note before Marcus had finished explaining. That detail mattered. A fair record listens before it writes. A false one arrives with blank spaces already shaped like conclusions. Marcus asked again for the cameras to be checked. He asked for the self-checkout record, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy receipt, and the freezer camera near the service panel. Each request made Victor more uncomfortable. Calder, however, treated the details as noise. To him, certainty was easier than accuracy. He had already decided which man in the room deserved belief. Marcus was eventually released from the office, but not cleared. That was another kind of cruelty. They did not need to hold him forever to damage him. They only needed to let him leave under a cloud, with his groceries disturbed, his cupcake ruined, and his name attached to an accusation that could follow him in ways no apology could fully undo. Victor kept the premium item bag. Calder kept copies of what he claimed mattered. The receipts Marcus had placed in his notebook were no longer where they had been. That was when the morning became more than humiliation. Marcus noticed the missing receipts before he reached the bus stop. He stood under the gray morning sky with the grocery bag hanging from one hand and the ruined cupcake container in the other. His fingers moved through the notebook once, then again, slowly. The pharmacy slip was still there, tucked between 2 pages. The small list was still there. But the grocery receipt and bakery receipt were gone. For a moment, he simply stood still. A younger man might have rushed back into the store. An angrier man might have shouted. A more naive man might have assumed it was a mistake. Marcus did none of those things. He looked back at the bright entrance, at the shoppers moving in and out as if nothing important had happened there. And he understood that the story had not ended when they let him walk away. It had just become harder to prove. He took out his pen and wrote down the time. That was the first thing Marcus did. Standing beneath the bus stop shelter with the ruined cupcake in one hand and the grocery bag in the other. He wrote the hour, the weather, the number of the checkout lane, the color of the manager's vest, the position of the freezer camera, and the exact moment he realized the receipts were missing. He did not write with trembling anger. He wrote with the careful discipline of a man who had learned that memory becomes stronger when it is anchored to details. The bus came 10 minutes later. Marcus sat near the back, holding the grocery bag close to his knees. People boarded around him with their phones, lunch bags, tired faces, and ordinary morning thoughts. No one knew that the man in the faded hoodie had just been publicly accused, humiliated, and quietly robbed of the very proof that could clear him. That was another cruelty of injustice. The world did not stop for it. Traffic moved. Coffee was poured. School doors opened. People complained about weather and schedules, while someone else's life had already been pushed off balance. Marcus kept looking at the cupcake. The plastic container had cracked on one corner. The blue frosting had smeared against the lid, and the little white sugar stars were pressed into a shapeless mess. It was still technically a cupcake, but it no longer looked like something a grandfather could place proudly in front of a birthday girl. It looked like evidence of carelessness, as if he had failed at the one small thing Nia had asked from him. That thought hurt more than the accusation. When Marcus reached the apartment, the sun had risen enough to make the windows look pale. Ruth was awake in the recliner, wrapped in the old brown blanket she insisted was still good, even though the edges had begun to fray. Illness had made her movements slower, but it had not taken the sharpness from her eyes. She knew Marcus's face before he said anything. Wives who have survived hard years learned to read silence the way others read headlines. Nia was at the kitchen table with her backpack open and one shoe untied, pretending to study a worksheet while secretly watching the door. She was trying to act older than 12. Children in houses with medical bills often learn that trick early. They learn to make their hopes smaller, to ask for less, to smile quickly when adults look tired. But when she saw the damaged cupcake container in Marcus's hand, the pretending fell away. Marcus placed the groceries on the table gently. He apologized without making excuses. He told Nia that something had happened at the store, that the cupcake had been damaged, and that he would make it right. He did not tell the whole story immediately. Not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because he could not bear to place the ugliness of that morning directly into her birthday, before she had even gone to school. But Nia saw more than he wanted her to see. She saw the way his fingers moved carefully, as if his wrist was sore. She saw the tightness around his mouth. She saw Ruth sit up straighter, suddenly alert. And she saw the black notebook on the table, open to a page filled with notes that did not look like a grocery list anymore. Ruth asked what they had done to him. Marcus could have softened it. He could have blamed confusion, policy, a misunderstanding, anything that made the world feel less intentional. But marriage had never survived between them on comfortable lies. So he told her enough. He told her that the assistant manager had accused him of taking items he never touched. He told her the security lead refused to check the receipts properly. He told her the crowd watched, and the young cashier looked as if she wanted to speak, but was afraid. He told her that the receipts were missing now, and that a service camera above the freezer might have seen what mattered. The room became very quiet. Ruth closed her eyes, not because she was surprised, but because some pain returns wearing new clothes. She had watched Marcus lose his records job years earlier for refusing to change a timestamp. She had watched people who barely knew him call him difficult, proud, stubborn, impossible. She had watched him take maintenance work with a straight back and a broken heart, because their family needed him more than his pride did. Now, years later, the same pattern had found him in a grocery store. A person with power had written a story, and Marcus had been placed inside it without permission. Nia did not cry right away. She stared at the ruined cupcake, then at her grandfather's notebook, then at his face. In that moment, something shifted in her. Childhood did not end all at once, but sometimes it lost a layer in a single morning. She began to understand that unfairness was not always loud enough for strangers to recognize. Sometimes it happened under fluorescent lights, while people kept shopping. Sometimes it wore a polite vest. Sometimes it spoke in a calm voice and counted on everyone else being too busy to care. Marcus wanted her to go to school. Nia wanted to stay home. Ruth settled the matter in the way she often did, with tenderness wrapped around steel. She told Nia that going to school did not mean forgetting, and staying home would not undo what had happened. Then she told Marcus to sit down and eat something before he started trying to carry the whole burden alone. That was Ruth. Even sick, she could still place order around pain. After Nia left, Marcus and Ruth sat at the kitchen table with the notebook between them. Marcus reconstructed everything from the moment he entered the store. Ruth wrote on a separate sheet while he spoke. She asked practical questions, the kind that forced memory to sharpen. Which register had he used? Which cashier helped with the apples? Was the bakery receipt printed separately? Where exactly had Victor stood? Which side of the freezer aisle held the small service camera? Did the security lead touch the groceries before or after the accusation became public? Did anyone else handle the notebook? Marcus answered carefully. He knew the danger of certainty when memory was still fresh and wounded. He did not exaggerate. He did not fill gaps with guesses. He marked what he knew, what he believed, and what needed proof. That distinction mattered. Lies often win by pretending confidence is the same as truth. Marcus had spent his life refusing that mistake. By mid-morning, Ruth had made one decision. They needed Grace Whitmore. Grace was not family by blood, but she had known Marcus long enough to understand what had happened to him the first time the courthouse turned on him. She was a civil rights attorney, with silver in her hair, patience in her voice, and a reputation for making institutions regret underestimating quiet people. Grace did not chase every rumor, and she did not make promises she could not keep. But when she believed a record had been manipulated, she moved quickly, because she knew evidence had a shelf life when guilty people controlled the shelves. Marcus did not want to call her at first. That was not pride exactly. It was exhaustion. He had been through the machinery before. He knew what it meant to become a case. He knew how people would examine his clothes, his job, his tone, his past, his finances, his family, and his anger. He knew they would ask why he did not act differently, why he did not speak louder, why he did not stay calmer, why he did not produce proof before the proof disappeared. Victims are often put on trial long before anyone admits a wrong has been done. But Ruth reminded him that silence had already cost him once. She did not say it cruelly. She said it as someone who had carried the same wound. The first time Marcus lost his position, they had tried to survive quietly. They had hoped that being honorable would be enough. It had not restored his title. It had not corrected the whispers. It had not taught the people who punished him to fear the truth. This time, Ruth said, they would not hand the lie a quiet room to grow in. So Marcus called Grace. He gave the facts simply. He did not dramatize the humiliation. He did not begin with outrage. He began with the missing receipts and the service camera. That told Grace everything she needed to know about the man on the other end of the phone. Many people call lawyers with feelings first. Marcus called with a chain of custody forming in his mind. Grace listened without interrupting. Then she asked for times, names, descriptions, and any proof still in his possession. When Marcus mentioned the freezer service camera, there was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition. Grace knew the value of a camera controlled outside the place where the lie had begun. She told Marcus not to contact the store again on his own, not to post anything, not to threaten anyone, and not to let anger give them a distraction. The first move, she said, had to be preservation. Within the hour, Grace's office sent formal preservation notices to the grocery store, the outside refrigeration company, the security contractor, and the pharmacy system connected to the purchase records. The letters demanded that all footage, transaction logs, incident notes, internal communications, and registered data from that morning be retained. They were not loud letters. They did not need to be. They carried the quiet force of someone who knew exactly where evidence liked to disappear. That was the first turn in the story. At the grocery store, Victor received the notice before lunch. He read it once in the small back office. Then he read it again, slower. His face changed, not because the letter accused him directly, but because it named things he had hoped no one would think to name. The freezer camera, the external maintenance vendor, the transaction logs, the incident note, the preserved receipts, the time window. Victor had expected Marcus to complain, maybe to call the store manager, maybe even to shout into a phone and be dismissed as emotional. He had not expected preservation language. He had not expected a lawyer to move before the end of the workday. Most of all, he had not expected the camera above the freezer case to become important. That little camera had always annoyed him. It belonged to the refrigeration maintenance company, not the store's main security system. It existed because expensive freezer failures could ruin inventory overnight, and corporate did not like losing money to broken equipment. It recorded service access, temperature checks, and movement around the freezer doors. Victor had ignored it because it was not part of the camera system he usually reviewed. It was just another small device with a blinking red light, too ordinary to fear. Now he feared it. Calder did too, though he showed it differently. The private security lead did not panic. Men like Calder rarely panic in a way others can see. Instead, he became more certain, more rigid, more offended that anyone would question his handling of the incident. He told himself the matter would hold because Victor had made the initial complaint and Marcus had looked suspicious. He repeated that phrase in his head until it felt almost like evidence. Looked suspicious. It was one of the most dangerous phrases in the world because it often revealed more about the person looking than the person being judged. By the end of that day, the store manager had been informed. Corporate had been informed. The outside maintenance vendor had been contacted. The incident had moved from a small back office into email threads, where careful people began choosing careful words. No one wanted to admit fault. No one wanted to accuse Victor too quickly. No one wanted to believe that a private security lead had helped bury receipts, or that an assistant manager had created a false accusation to distract from missing inventory. Institutions rarely begin by searching for truth. They begin by searching for exposure. At home, Marcus waited. Waiting was harder than writing the time, harder than calling Grace, harder even than walking out of the store with strangers' judgment still clinging to his back. Waiting gave the mind too much room. He imagined the footage being deleted. He imagined the vendor saying the camera had not recorded. He imagined Victor explaining everything away, Calder doubling down, the cashier staying silent, and the story becoming another fog of maybe and maybe not. Ruth watched him pace the small living room until his knees started bothering him. Then she told him to sit. He did. Not because pacing was useless, but because Ruth had always been better at making commands sound like care. Nia came home from school quieter than usual. She had told no one about the cupcake. She had not eaten the lunch Ruth packed. She had spent the day thinking about the way her grandfather wrote things down, about the receipts missing from the notebook, about the cashier who had seen the truth and said nothing in time. Children often understand injustice in simpler language than adults. To Nia, the question was not complicated. Her grandfather had paid. Someone lied. People watched. The proof had to be found. That evening, she sat beside Marcus with the damaged cupcake container between them. He had tried to buy another one from a different bakery on the way home, but the store had only plain vanilla left, and something in him refused to pretend replacement was the same as repair. Nia surprised him by touching the cracked container gently and saying it still counted because he had tried. Marcus looked away then, because grace from a child can break a man more completely than cruelty from an adult. He promised her again that he would make it right. But even as he said it, he knew making it right would not mean only replacing a cupcake. It would mean pulling a lie into the light. It would mean forcing people who had looked away to look again. It would mean entering the machinery he had spent years avoiding, and trusting that this time, the record might be stronger than the people trying to bend it. The next morning, Grace called. Her voice was controlled, but Marcus heard the energy beneath it. The maintenance company had confirmed the freezer camera existed. It had recorded continuously that morning. Better yet, the footage was stored through the vendor's cloud system, not the grocery store's local office. The store could request access, but it could not quietly erase the original. The files were being preserved. Marcus closed his eyes. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to breathe fully. Grace warned him that preserved did not mean won. Footage had to be reviewed. Angles could disappoint. People could claim context. Lawyers could make simple truths look complicated if they had enough time and money. But she also told him the camera covered part of the aisle near the freezer and part of the path behind the customer service counter. That was enough to matter. Maybe enough to change everything. 2 days later, Grace asked Marcus to come to her office. Ruth insisted on going with him. Naya insisted too, but Marcus hesitated. He wanted to protect her from seeing the worst parts again. Ruth gently reminded him that Naya had already seen the ruined cupcake, the trembling hands, and the silence after. Protecting children did not always mean hiding truth from them. Sometimes it meant letting them see truth handled properly. Grace's office was on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. It smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and raincoats drying near the door. Nothing about it was flashy. The chairs did not match. The shelves were crowded. The walls held framed certificates, community awards, and photographs of people who looked as if they had once arrived there with their names damaged and left with them restored. Grace greeted Marcus with both warmth and focus. She did not pity him. Marcus appreciated that. Pity can make a person feel small, even when it is kindly meant. Grace treated him like a witness to his own life, a man whose memory mattered. She placed a folder on the table, then turned her laptop so the family could see the screen. The first clip was from the self-checkout. It showed Marcus scanning the bread, soup, apples, and oat milk. It showed the young cashier assisting him when the machine paused. It showed Marcus finishing the purchase and placing the receipt into his notebook. The angle was distant, but clear enough. Grace did not speak over it. She let the truth occupy the room without decoration. Ruth's hand found Marcus's under the table. The second clip showed the bakery counter. Marcus paid separately. The cupcake was placed in its container. The receipt was printed. Marcus tucked it away. Nia watched that part with her lips pressed tight, as if she were trying not to feel too much in front of adults. The cupcake, before it was ruined, looked bright and small and innocent. Then came the freezer camera. The footage was not beautiful. It was high, slightly wide, and colder in color than the store's main cameras. But it saw what mattered. It saw Victor near the premium shelf before Marcus ever entered that aisle. It saw him handling the bag of expensive items. It saw him place the bag behind the customer service counter, out of the normal customer path. It saw Marcus pass by later without touching those items at all. Grace paused the video there. No one said anything. Then she let it continue. The camera did not show every angle of the confrontation, but it showed enough. Victor brought the bag forward after Marcus had paid. Calder stepped in. Marcus reached toward his notebook, then stopped. The crowd shifted around them. The young cashier looked over from the self-checkout station. The cupcake fell. A shopping cart wheel caught the edge of the container and crushed it as the shopper moved past. unaware or unwilling to stop. Nia made a small sound then. Marcus reached for her hand, but his eyes stayed on the screen. The final clip showed the back hallway. It was not from the freezer camera, but from another angle Grace had obtained through the preservation demand. It showed Calder alone after the incident, holding folded slips of paper. It showed him place them into his pocket instead of attaching them to the incident materials. It did not capture his thoughts. It did not need to. Some actions are plain enough when placed beside the truth they were meant to hide. Grace closed the laptop. The office felt different after that. Not triumphant. Not yet. Truth, when finally seen, does not always bring immediate joy. Sometimes it brings grief first, because it proves the pain was real, the suspicion was manufactured, and the humiliation did not have to happen. Ruth was the first to speak, but her words were less a question than a verdict. They had known it. Now the record knew it too. Marcus sat very still. For years, people had told him in different ways that records were cold things, that paperwork had no soul, that video could not understand dignity, that timestamps were technical details. But in Grace's office, watching the lie unravel frame by frame, Marcus felt again why he had once sacrificed his position over 14 minutes. The record could not love him. It could not comfort Nia. It could not undo Ruth's worry or restore the cupcake. But it could refuse to forget. And sometimes refusing to forget is where justice begins. Grace explained the next steps. They would not simply release the most shocking clip and hope public anger did the rest. That was how stories became noise. They would build the timeline first. The self-checkout receipt, the bakery purchase, the pharmacy record, the freezer camera, the back hallway footage, the missing slips, the internal note written before Marcus's explanation was complete, the cashier's statement, if she could find the courage to give one, the prior inventory discrepancies connected to Victor. Marcus listened carefully. He was relieved, but he was not naive. He knew the other side would respond. Victor would claim confusion. Calder would claim procedure. Corporate would claim concern. Someone would say the footage lacked context, even though the whole lie had depended on denying context in the first place. Someone would say Marcus should have been more cooperative. Someone would say the security lead was only doing his job. Someone would say mistakes happen. Grace knew all of that too. That was why she looked at Marcus and told him they would not let the case become a debate about his attitude. They would make it about the record, not feelings first, not outrage first. The record first. Because once the record was clear, the feelings would know where to stand. Before they left the office, Nia asked if the video meant everyone would believe him now. It was the kind of question only a child could ask with such painful innocence. Grace did not lie to her. She said some people believe truth when they see it. Some people resist it because it costs them something. And some people only believe it when everyone else does. That was why truth needed witnesses, documents, pressure, and courage all at once. Nia nodded as if she understood more than anyone wanted her to. On the way home, Marcus looked out the bus window at the grocery store when they passed it. Through the glass, he could see shoppers moving under bright lights, pushing carts, comparing prices, choosing cereal, buying flowers, living inside the comfort of ordinary errands. The building looked the same. That bothered him for reasons he could not fully explain. A place where a lie had been built should have looked different afterward. It should have carried a mark. But buildings rarely confess. People have to make them. That night, Grace began preparing the release. Not a reckless post. Not an emotional accusation thrown into the internet. A structured statement with timestamps, preserved footage, transaction confirmation, and a clear demand for accountability. She contacted the store's corporate office again, this time with enough attached proof to make denial dangerous. She contacted the security contractor. She prepared to contact local media if they chose silence over action. Victor did not sleep much that night. Neither did Calder. But Marcus did, for the first time since the morning in the store. Not deeply, not without waking once to check the notebook on the bedside table, but enough to let his body rest. He had spent years believing the truth mattered even when nobody thanked him for protecting it. Now, at last, the truth had begun protecting him back. By sunrise, the story was no longer just his memory. It was a timeline. It was footage. It was receipts. It was a young cashier deciding whether fear would own her voice. It was a granddaughter learning that dignity sometimes needed documents beside it. And it was a quiet man in a faded hoodie, standing at the edge of a fight he never wanted, realizing that the people who tried to erase him had left their own fingerprints all over the lie. Grace did not release the evidence that afternoon. She knew better than to throw truth into the world before giving it a spine. A raw clip could be twisted. A single angle could be questioned. A few seconds could become entertainment, argument, or noise. What Marcus needed was not noise. He needed a record so complete that every excuse would have to walk past its own reflection before reaching the public. So, Grace built the timeline carefully. She placed Marcus's notebook beside the self-checkout log. She placed the bakery receipt beside the footage of the cupcake purchase. She placed the pharmacy time beside the bus schedule. She placed Victor's movement near the premium shelf beside the moment the planted bag appeared at the counter. She placed Calder's internal incident note beside the video, showing that the note had been written before Marcus's explanation had been properly recorded. Then she placed the missing receipts beside the back hallway footage, where folded slips of paper moved into the wrong hands and out of the official story. By the time she finished, the lie no longer looked like a misunderstanding. It looked designed. Marcus sat across from her while she reviewed it all, his hands folded around the black notebook he had carried for years. Ruth sat beside him, quiet but steady. Naya sat closer than usual, not because she was afraid of the office, but because she wanted her grandfather to feel that he wasn't standing alone anymore. On the screen, the grocery store looked ordinary. Bright lights, clean floors, carts, a bakery case, people moving through their errands. And inside all that ordinary brightness, a lie had been placed like a trap. That was what made the footage so disturbing. No one had needed darkness. No one had needed an alley, a locked room, or a dramatic threat. The harm had happened in public, under lights, beside shelves of cereal and bread, while ordinary shoppers decided the scene was none of their business. Grace understood that this was the part people would recognize. Not everyone had been falsely accused in a grocery store, but many people knew what it felt like to be judged before being heard. Many knew what it meant for a confident person with a title to be believed faster than a quiet person with proof. Before releasing anything, Grace gave the store one final chance. Her letter was direct. She told corporate that the footage, transaction records, witness information, and preserved notes confirmed Marcus had paid for his items, had not touched the premium goods, and had been falsely accused in a way that caused public humiliation and emotional harm. She demanded a public correction, an apology naming the wrong, immediate action against Victor, full disclosure from the security contractor, protection for the cashier, and compensation that recognized not only the ruined groceries, but the damage to Marcus's dignity. The response came the next morning. It was polished, careful, and empty. Corporate expressed concern. They said they were reviewing the matter. They asked for patience. They claimed they wanted to avoid rushing to judgment, even though their employees had rushed to judgment when Marcus was the one on the floor. They did not name Victor's conduct. They did not admit the receipts had been removed. They did not apologize to Marcus directly. Most of all, they asked Grace not to release anything publicly while their internal review continued. Grace read the email once, then set it down. Marcus did not need her to explain. He had heard that language before. It was the language of institutions buying time, hoping fatigue would do what denial could not. It was the same kind of smooth language that had followed him out of the records division 7 years earlier, when refusing to change a timestamp had somehow become a question about attitude and teamwork. The words were different, but the shape was familiar. This time Marcus did not bend. He gave Grace permission to release the evidence. The statement went out that evening. It was not emotional in the way people expected. It did not beg for sympathy. It did not decorate pain. It laid out the morning with timestamps, receipts, preserved footage, and a clear explanation of what the video showed. It said Marcus had been falsely accused after paying for his groceries. It said a store manager had introduced items Marcus never handled. It said a private security lead had ignored available proof. It said receipts later disappeared from Marcus's notebook. It said the freezer service camera, forgotten by the people who built the lie, had preserved the truth. For the first hour, only a few people noticed. A local reporter shared it, then a community organizer, then a courthouse employee who remembered Marcus from the records division and wrote that he had once been punished for protecting evidence too carefully. That one sentence changed the temperature of the story. People began looking more closely. They watched the clip of Victor placing the bag. They watched Marcus paying at the self-checkout. They watched the cupcake fall and be crushed while people continued shopping. They watched the young cashier's face as she realized what was happening. And then they watched Marcus, calm, humiliated, and observant, noticing the camera no one else remembered. By midnight, the store's silence had become louder than any statement it could have issued. The next morning, news vans arrived outside the grocery store. Corporate closed the entrance for an hour and called it a security concern. Employees were told not to speak to reporters. Victor did not come to work. Calder's contractor announced that he had been placed on leave pending review. The store manager released a short message about taking the allegations seriously, but by then, the public had seen enough polished language to recognize fear wearing a suit. The cashier came forward that afternoon. Her name was Lena Ortiz. She was 19, still new enough to believe that doing a job well might protect her, and old enough to realize that workplaces often protect power before truth. She contacted Grace first because she was terrified of losing her job. Grace took her statement privately and made sure she understood what could happen. Lena said Marcus paid. She said she helped clear the self-checkout warning. She said she saw him place the receipt into his notebook. She said Victor had been unusually focused on Marcus before the accusation. She said she wanted to speak earlier, but fear had locked her throat. Marcus did not condemn her for that fear. He knew how fear worked when the person above you controlled your schedule, your hours, and your ability to pay rent. he also knew that courage delayed was not the same as courage denied. Lena had come forward before the lie could fully settle. That mattered. Her statement pushed the story further. Other employees began to talk. One remembered Victor moving premium items near the stockroom on previous shifts. Another remembered inventory reports that never seemed to match what workers saw. A third said Victor had warned employees not to question management decisions in front of customers. Piece by piece, the image of a concerned assistant manager collapsed. What appeared in its place was a man protecting himself by creating suspicion around someone else. Corporate suspended Victor officially by the end of the week. The word suspended did not satisfy Nia. She wanted stronger words. She wanted fired, exposed, punished, named. Marcus understood her anger, but he had learned that justice often moved slower than the wound. It did not mean it was not moving. Grace reminded the family that the first fall of a powerful person is rarely the final consequence. It is only the moment when distance begins. People who were once protected by institutions suddenly become liabilities to them. That was happening to Victor now. Calder tried to defend himself. Through the security contractor, he claimed he had acted based on the information provided by store management. He claimed Marcus had been uncooperative. He claimed the scene was tense. He claimed his decisions were reasonable under the circumstances. But the footage weakened every sentence. It showed Marcus calm. It showed the receipts. It showed Calder ignoring requests to verify the purchases. It showed him writing the internal note in a way that placed conclusion before investigation. The more Calder explained, the worse he looked. Grace filed the lawsuit before the public conversation could fade. The complaint named the grocery store, Victor, the private security contractor, and Calder. It described false accusation, negligent supervision, intentional emotional harm, mishandling of proof, and a pattern of conduct that allowed a low-status customer to be treated as guilty because it was convenient. But the most powerful part of the complaint wasn't legal language. It was the story of a man who had spent years protecting records from manipulation, only to be nearly destroyed by people who assumed no one would check the record. That part traveled. Church leaders repeated it. Local teachers discussed it with older students. Workers at the courthouse whispered about it in elevators. People who had once ignored Marcus while he mopped their hallway began remembering that he had been more than a maintenance worker. Some remembered him from the records division. Some remembered his quiet refusal to alter a time entry years earlier. A few remembered how quickly he had disappeared from that department afterward. Then came the envelope. It arrived at Grace's office with no return address. Inside were copies of old courthouse documents, performance reviews from before Marcus's refusal, all positive. Notes from after his refusal, suddenly critical. Internal emails discussing his lack of flexibility, a memo suggesting reassignment, and a copy of the disputed time entry request that had cost him his position without ever being called punishment. Grace studied the papers for a long time. They did not directly say the courthouse had retaliated. Documents created by careful people rarely confess so openly. But the pattern was there. Before Marcus refused to alter the record, he was reliable, precise, trusted, and professional. After he refused, he became difficult, resistant, and not a good fit. The words had been chosen to hide the truth, but the dates placed them under a light they could not escape. When Marcus saw the documents, he did not smile. Vindication is not always joyful. Sometimes, it feels like standing in front of an old wound and realizing it was exactly as deep as you remembered. For 7 years, Marcus had carried the weight of being quietly demoted, while others called it complicated. Now the paper said what his heart had known. He had not lost his place because he failed the work. He had lost it because he respected the work more than the people above him did. Nia read the documents at the kitchen table. This time, she cried openly. Not because of the grocery store, but because she understood that her grandfather's suffering had a history. The ruined cupcake had been painful. The false accusation had been cruel. But the old records showed something larger. Marcus had been paying for honesty long before she was old enough to understand the cost. The lawsuit changed after that. Grace added the old courthouse documents, not as a separate fight, but as context for who Marcus was and why the grocery store's assumption had been so wrong. He was not a man inventing a story after being embarrassed. He was a man with a documented history of protecting truth, even when truth punished him. The very quality Victor and Calder had mistaken for weakness was the thing that made Marcus dangerous to their lie. Discovery began. That was when the defendants lost control. Emails showed Victor had been warned about inventory discrepancies before Marcus entered the store. Schedule notes showed he had been alone near the premium goods before the accusation. Transaction records confirmed Marcus paid. Internal messages showed corporate employees worrying less about Marcus's innocence and more about exposure. Calder's incident note had inconsistencies that grew sharper when placed beside video timestamps. The more documents Grace collected, the more the defense shifted from denial to minimization. They began calling it a mistake. Grace called it a sequence. A mistake is one wrong turn. A sequence is a path. Victor moving the goods, watching Marcus, producing the bag, ignoring the request for camera review, allowing the public accusation, and participating in the removal of receipts was not a single misunderstanding. Calder accepting Victor's version, dismissing Marcus's receipts, documenting guilt before verification, and keeping proof out of the record was not one bad moment. The harm was built step by step, and every step had a person standing on it. Victor broke first. In deposition, he tried to sound offended. He said he was protecting the store. He said inventory pressure had made everyone alert. He said Marcus had seemed suspicious because he moved slowly, kept looking around, and carried a notebook. Grace let him say all of it. Then she placed the video stills in front of him one by one. Victor near the premium shelf. Victor carrying the bag. Victor placing it behind the counter. Victor watching Marcus. Victor producing the bag after Marcus had paid. Victor looking toward the freezer aisle when Marcus asked for cameras. By the end, Victor's confidence had drained out of him. He admitted that he had handled the bag before the accusation. Then he admitted he had not seen Marcus touch those items. Then he admitted he had been under pressure over missing inventory. Each admission came smaller than the last, as if the truth had to be dragged out through his teeth. But it came. Calder lasted longer. He was the kind of man who had built his self-image around certainty, and certainty can become a locked room. He insisted he had acted reasonably. He insisted Marcus's calmness had seemed calculated. He insisted the situation required control. Grace asked him whether control mattered more than accuracy. He avoided the question. She asked whether he had checked the receipts before writing the incident note. He did not answer directly. She asked whether a person in plain clothes was easier for him to doubt than a manager in a vest. That question stayed in the room long after his lawyer objected. The case did not reach a full public trial. That disappointed some people, but Grace told Marcus that justice was not measured only by courtroom drama. After the depositions, after the documents, after the public pressure, and after the security contractor realized Calder had become impossible to defend cleanly, the defendants asked for mediation. Marcus did not want a quiet settlement that buried the truth. Grace made that clear before the first meeting began. No agreement would exist without public correction. That became the line. The final resolution came with money, but money was not the heart of it. The store issued a public statement acknowledging that Marcus had paid for his purchases, had been wrongly accused, and had been treated in a way that violated basic standards of dignity and fairness. Victor was terminated. The company referred his conduct related to inventory manipulation for further review. Calder was dismissed by the security contractor and later lost his license to work in private security after the review board found he had mishandled the incident and failed to preserve customer proof. The store agreed to retrain employees, revise accusation procedures, protect workers who came forward, and require immediate preservation of footage when a customer disputed an accusation. Grace also secured something Marcus had not expected. A correction letter was sent to the courthouse leadership, accompanied by the old documents and the public record of the grocery case. It did not force the county to rewrite history completely, but it forced them to acknowledge that Marcus's prior work and records had been professional, careful, and respected before the disputed reassignment. It also led to a small public recognition from a county oversight committee praising the importance of evidence integrity and naming Marcus as someone who had upheld that principle. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. The ceremony was small. Marcus almost did not attend. He did not trust ceremonies easily. Too many institutions used plaques to cover the cracks they refused to repair. But Ruth told him that Nia needed to see the room say his name correctly. So he went. He wore his best jacket, the one Ruth had brushed twice that morning. Nia stood beside him with her shoulders straight. Grace stood in the back, watching like a person who had seen many victories and knew none of them arrived clean. When Marcus's name was spoken, he did not feel pride first. He felt the younger version of himself standing somewhere inside him, the man who had refused to change 14 minutes, and then walked out of the records division with his future quietly damaged. He wished that man could have known this moment would come. Not because it would undo the loss, but because it would prove the loss had not been meaningless. Afterward, Nia asked if he felt better. Marcus told her the truth in the gentlest way he could. He felt lighter, but not untouched. There are some things justice repairs, and some things it can only honor. The public apology did not erase the grocery store floor. The settlement did not uncrush the cupcake. Victor's termination did not give back the years Marcus had spent being treated like a man who had fallen because of his own attitude. But the lie had not won. That mattered. The record had held. A week later, Marcus returned to the grocery store. He went alone first. Ruth wanted to come. Nia wanted to come. Grace advised him not to push himself. But Marcus knew there was a difference between avoiding a wound and letting it own the map of your life. He needed to walk through those doors again under his own power. The store looked the same and different. The floors still shone. The lights still hummed. Customers still moved through the aisles with baskets and carts. But near the customer service counter, Victor was gone. Near the entrance, a new sign explained customer verification procedures without naming the case. Employees glanced at Marcus with recognition. some embarrassed, some respectful. Lena saw him from the self-checkout station and froze for half a second before stepping forward. She did not offer a dramatic apology in front of everyone. She did something better. She treated him carefully, normally, respectfully. She asked if he needed help finding anything. Marcus thanked her. That was all. Sometimes restoration is not a speech. Sometimes it is the ordinary courtesy that should have been there from the beginning. He walked to the bakery case. There, behind the glass, was a row of blue cupcakes with white sugar stars. Marcus looked at them for a long time. The worker behind the counter waited without rushing him. Finally, he bought one, then another. Then a small box of 4, because this time he could afford to bring enough home for everyone. He paid, took the receipt, looked at it, and placed it into his notebook. At home, Naya laughed when she saw the box. Not because the old pain was funny, but because joy had returned to a place where humiliation had once tried to settle. Ruth made tea. Grace came by later with documents for Marcus to sign, but stayed for a cupcake because Naya insisted. They did not pretend everything was simple now. Ruth still had appointments. Bills still arrived. Marcus still worked hard. The world had not transformed into fairness overnight, but something inside the family had changed. Nia no longer saw her grandfather as only a tired man who worked before sunrise. She saw him as someone who had protected truth even when truth cost him. Ruth no longer had to carry the old courthouse wound in silence. Grace no longer had to wonder whether the system that punished Marcus would ever be forced to face even a small part of what it had done. And Marcus, though still humble, no longer moved through the world quite as invisibly as before. With part of the settlement, he started a small fund. He named it the Hale Evidence Integrity Fund, though Nia teased him for choosing such a serious name. The fund helped ordinary people preserve records quickly when they were accused by employers, landlords, stores, agencies, or anyone else with more power and better paperwork. It helped pay for copies, letters, legal consultations, and emergency preservation requests. Marcus did not want fame. He wanted fewer people standing alone under fluorescent lights while someone else wrote the first lie. He began speaking at community centers. At first, he hated it. Marcus had never enjoyed being watched. But he understood that his story could teach what his silence could not. He told people to keep receipts, to write times down, to ask for cameras early, to save messages, to notice who controls the record. He told them that documentation was not distrust. Sometimes it was protection. Sometimes it was dignity given a place to stand. Nia came with him when she could. She sat in the back with a notebook of her own, writing things down in a hand that looked more and more like his. Years later, Marcus would remember that more clearly than any news clip. Not the headlines, not the settlement, not Victor's downfall or Calder's dismissal. He would remember his granddaughter learning that truth was not just something a person felt. It was something a person protected. One evening, after a community meeting, Naya asked him whether he ever wished he had shouted that day in the store. Marcus thought about it longer than she expected. Then he told her that part of him did. Part of him wished he had made every shopper stop, every employee listen, every liar feel the force of his pain. But another part of him knew that anger alone would have been used against him. The world often demands perfect calm from the wounded and perfect trust in the powerful. That is not fair. But Marcus had learned how to survive inside that unfairness long enough for the record to speak. Nia did not like that answer. Marcus did not either. But truth is not always satisfying in the places where pain first asks for satisfaction. Sometimes the deeper victory comes later, when the lie has exhausted itself and the quiet details remain standing. Months passed. The grocery store changed in small ways. Employees received training that no one could dismiss as optional. Customer accusations required documented verification before public confrontation. Footage preservation became automatic when disputes were raised. Workers had a protected way to report pressure from management. None of it made the store perfect. No policy can. But policies are doors. And before Marcus, people like him had often been left outside them. Lena kept her job and eventually became a shift lead. She carried the memory of her fear with humility, not as punishment, but as instruction. When new employees joined, she told them that silence could feel safe in the moment and still become a wound later. She never used Marcus's story carelessly, but the lesson shaped the way she treated people. Victor did not return. For a while, he tried to describe himself as a victim of public outrage, but the inventory findings followed him. People who build lies often expect sympathy when the lie collapses on them. Marcus did not celebrate Victor's ruin, but he did not confuse mercy with denial. Victor had chosen a scapegoat. He had chosen Marcus because he thought a tired black man in a faded hoodie would be easy to doubt. The consequence belonged to him. Calder disappeared from private security work. That, too, was justice of a kind. The authority he had used to silence a man was taken from him because he had proven he could not be trusted with it. Marcus did not need to see him suffer. He only needed to know that the next tired customer would not have to face that same cold certainty from the same man. As for Marcus, he kept working, not because he had to accept invisibility again, but because honest work had never been the shame. The shame had always belonged to those who looked at the work and decided the worker mattered less. He still rose before sunrise. He still walked through blue darkness. He still carried the black notebook. But now, when courthouse employees passed him, some greeted him by name. Some looked embarrassed. A few even thanked him. Marcus accepted the thanks without becoming dependent on it. He had learned not to build his dignity on other people finally noticing what should have been obvious. Recognition was welcome, but it was not the source. His worth had existed on the grocery store floor. It had existed when the cupcake was crushed. It had existed when the receipts were missing, when the crowd looked away, when Victor smiled, when Calder wrote, when no apology had yet arrived. That was the lesson he wanted Nia to keep. A person is not made innocent by footage. The footage only proves what was already true. A person is not made worthy by a public apology. The apology only admits what should never have been denied. And dignity does not begin when powerful people recognize it. Dignity is already there, even when the world refuses to bow its head before it. On Nia's next birthday, there were blue cupcakes on the kitchen table again. This time, the frosting was perfect. The little white sugar stars sat untouched. Ruth lit one candle because Nia said 12 had been too many last year, and 13 felt too dramatic. Marcus laughed at that, a quiet laugh that made Ruth smile. For a moment, there were no lawyers, no footage, no statements, no old courthouse documents, no grocery store floor. There was only family, warm light, and a child blowing out a candle in a room where love had survived the attempt to shame it. After Nia made her wish, she asked Marcus if he wanted to know what it was. He told her wishes should be kept private. She said this one could be shared because it was not only for her. She had wished that people would learn to check the truth before they decided who someone was. Marcus looked at Ruth then, and Ruth looked back at him with tears in her eyes, because that was the kind of wish no child should have to make, and every adult should have already honored. Years later, people would still ask Marcus about the freezer camera. They wanted to know how he noticed it. They wanted to know whether he felt lucky. Marcus always answered carefully. Luck had played a role, maybe. But what saved him wasn't luck alone. It was a lifetime of paying attention. It was a notebook in a pocket. It was a wife who refused silence. It was a granddaughter who believed him before the world did. It was a lawyer who moved before evidence could disappear. It was a cashier who found her courage. And it was one small red light blinking above a freezer case, while everyone else assumed the truth had no witness. The world is full of people like Marcus. People who clean buildings before sunrise. People who count coins at pharmacy counters. People who keep receipts because they know how quickly suspicion can find them. People who are treated as background until someone needs a scapegoat. People who have learned to stay calm, not because they feel no anger, but because they know their anger will be used as evidence against them. And the world is also full of people standing nearby with carts and baskets, deciding whether to look away. That is where justice often begins or dies. Not only in courts, not only in statements, not only in viral clips. It begins in the small human moment, when someone sees a person being judged too quickly and decides that comfort is not more important than truth. It begins when a cashier speaks, when a shopper records, when a worker preserves a file, when a family writes down the time, when someone refuses to let the first version of a story become the only version. Marcus Hale did not set out to become a symbol. He set out to buy groceries, medicine, and one blue cupcake for a child he loved. But the people who tried to humiliate him forgot something that powerful people often forget. Quiet people are not empty. Tired people are not careless. Poor people are not proof of guilt. And a man who has spent his life protecting records knows exactly where truth likes to hide. So if you remember anything from Marcus's story, remember this. Never decide what a person is before you know what happened to them. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness. Never assume dignity disappears just because a crowd refuses to see it. And when the lie is loud, rushed, and confident, look for the small thing still blinking in the corner. Because sometimes justice does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a receipt, a notebook, a witness who finally speaks, and a forgotten camera that refuses to look away.